And we are live. This is Dark Journalist. Oh, what a fantastic crowd we have out there tonight already in the Ideas Room. Of course, tonight I'm joined by the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
And Olivia, you know, we've heard of the Knights of Columbus.
Yes.
And we certainly have heard of the Knights of Malta.
Yes.
But tonight, it's the Knights of Pythias.
How do you spell that?
Well, it's
Pythias.
Pythias. It's based on a Greek legend. But the Knights of Pythias are very interesting, and I'll tell you why, because it answers the question, what does FDR, Trump, and Nelson Rockefeller, what do they all have in common? This is going to be kind of an important revelation as we go. It's great to see everyone out there. We're going to go deep tonight in this special report outlining the continuity of government and its relationship to the UFO file, but going deep with some of the incidents that have happened recently that really illustrate this relationship of this secret structure on one side, the continuity of government, kind of complete takeover, underground government aspect, and then on top of that, the secrecy of the X-Protect UFO file. The combination there and the things that are happening in relationship to both right now as they're trying to utilize these secret emergency powers for full control, for full takeover control. And we're going to see how in this country, the continuity of government got started, but now it's a global process. And this is very interesting because I'm going to give you some examples in Australia and Canada of secret actions that have been taking place. And here in America, secret actions relating directly to the continuity of government program. We have a lot of things to catch up on tonight. It's going to be major. Some of the revelations are really earth-shattering with this one. So I'm so glad you could be here with us. The other thing I want to mention is, of course, in the second half of the program of tonight's broadcast, we're going to be taking your questions. And I always love that as well because we have Olivia here to go through those, and she's going through them right now. You can ask away. And in the second half, we're going to get to those. Before I jump in to everything, Miss Olivia, how's the temperature?
Everybody seems to be in a great mood.
That's great. Well, that's it for Friday night, right? We can just sign off right now. We already are a success. What's great about some of the things that have been happening, and it's actually been a momentous summer on the political stage, of course, the Trump Mar-a-Lago FBI raid, very telling about desperation in certain circles to find something that Trump had in his possession. I'm going to show tonight how this all goes back to just when President Trump left the White House as well, and how there are many liberal pundits out there who already knew that this whole cycle of bizarre, Trump has classified info, we're going to get it, there's a legal tussle. This was already in the zeitgeist before he left. And so the things that we're seeing now are just reflections of somebody's plan from a year and 8 months ago. And that's very significant because of the timing of them pulling the trigger on this just before the midterm elections. That's supposed to help them. There's a number of things that they're engaged in right now. They're supposed to help them. And we'll see if all those rosy scenarios they created for themselves actually work out. Before we get started, I want to remind everyone to go to darkjournalist.com as well and sign up for our free newsletter if you haven't already, to make sure that we have that direct pipeline with each other. For all of those of you who are new here tonight, make sure you sign up for that newsletter. That's how you get information about new shows, some exciting X-Series episodes we have coming up for you in September, and also some fascinating interviews coming up with special reports this month. Incredible things coming. There's events coming up also in the fall and documentary announcements. So you're going to want all that, and it's all free for you. But we've seen really extreme censorship online, and this has been disturbing for a number of reasons, because we hear that the tech companies are going to amp up a lot of the censorship going into the fall because they want a certain outcome, shall we say. And
what they have up their sleeve is truly chilling.
Oh, no question. No question. The things that are gearing up right now have to do directly with everyday means of life, including the food supply and, drought and phony drought. and the things that are being engineered. And we're seeing it all over America, of course, and they certainly do their fair share of it here in Cambridge as well. We're certainly not immune, especially since in part, this is their headquarters, is right behind us, the lovely Harvard University, which is quite nice this time of year, I would say. Now, so let's get into a couple of things that have happened here over the past week. Of course, we mentioned, we did all these episodes about the FBI raid, how it was related to the UFO file and classified information, and how they needed this real MacGuffin to find something in Trump's possession. And either, the idea being that he either lured them in with this or was caught off guard. It's not very easy to say, but I think it is significant, the take off the gloves approach on behalf of the Justice Department, flouting generations really of tradition by raiding a president of the United States. Just not done. Even, Reagan during Iran-Contra, Nixon during Watergate, Clinton during his scandals, Obama. I mean, it's just not done. So, the fact that it is being done here means that they're absolutely committed to placing Trump in a position where he is not able to run in 2024. This could backfire on them rather dramatically. And whether you fall on the right side of the fence, the left, or in the middle, these are the types of unconstitutional actions that we need to watch out for. Because it doesn't serve anybody to have unconstitutional actions like these being laid out there. The secrecy around the UFO file is also highly unconstitutional, as is the continuity of government program. So we're in a sea, really a swamp, really, of unconstitutionality as we get into these subjects tonight. I wanted to point out that some of these interesting things relating to this have to do with the secret system of finance. And I've done some episodes that we put out with Dr. Joseph Farrell. There's one that we put in the member section, and that thing would not survive in the public for very long, but maybe an edited version would. But we put that up there in the member section. It's called The Secret Money, and I highly recommend this. If you are a member, you're going to be enjoying that. Of course, part one of this interview is available already on this channel, and Dr. Farrell going where only Dr. Farrell can go, which is a very important episode.
And I just want to say, Najat, who has been with us since the beginning, thought it was the best episode ever.
Wow. Well, that's saying something. Yeah, really goes into some interesting territory, and it takes us from Confederate gold all the way up to the strange visit that Pelosi made to Taiwan, and it links that secret system of finance throughout. Bearer bonds, of course, we've done these unusual episodes before about the billions in bearer bonds that these guys were caught with on the Italian border, and how they were Kennedy bonds, but they were ascribed to the United States. And there was an attempt to figure out what these bonds were, and if this secret system of finance just operates among these people, and this is how they move gold and other assets completely outside of the purview of governments. So there's a lot of that in there. I highly recommend it. Money becomes very important to this whole discussion, and so much of that is part of the reason that they want to give us this version of the CBDC, which is so dangerous, that central bank digital currency, and how it's very important to resist that and to really move, towards cash, especially with those 80,000 IRS agents. You can't beat it, right? I was seeing these videos of them training some of these agents now. They're getting all this gun training, and just to see these IRS people, with these guns drawn and all that stuff. I mean, the IRS shouldn't have any kind of enforcement like that at all. And a lot of these Republicans are saying if they get in the fall, they'll throw out all of that stuff that Biden just rifled through on a Sunday in the middle of August when everyone was on vacation, not paying attention. And you have real traitors, in a sense, to their conservative principles, guys like Joe Manchin on the Democratic side. I'll never vote for anything like this. And then, they polish him up and roll him out there and he signs right along. So the Democrat Party is completely gone. The Republican Party still has that root, that base that respects the Constitution. And so they're fast becoming a major target. But then when you say Republican Party, it's very hard. And when I speak about these things, we have to understand them in a particular way. It's not a right or left question or Republican, Independent, or Democrat, because look at the Liz Cheneys of the world, say, versus the Rand Pauls of the world. Those are both Republicans, diametrically opposed. One's really into, bombing other countries for their oil and destroying civil liberties. And the other one is for disentangling us from those types of foreign pursuits and bringing us back to constitutional government. So therefore, it's very tricky when we look across the aisle for these different parties. But if we understand it more as who is it that's respecting the Constitution, it becomes very easy. And that's the way we're going to look at it here tonight. I want to point out some very odd things, because when we get into COG tonight, we're going to see one of the big authors of the version of it that we're dealing with now, which was built largely in the 1980s, is Dick Cheney, former Vice President Dick Cheney, former Defense Secretary Dick Cheney, former Congressman Dick Cheney, this guy goes all the way back to Nixon. And
does he really?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. He worked for Nixon. He worked for Ford. And so did Donald Rumsfeld. In fact, Donald Rumsfeld being the youngest defense secretary and then coming back to reprise his role some 25 years later. So he's defense secretary in 76, and then 2001, there he is again. Well, he's also one of the COG architects. And so I want to go into it tonight and give us that background on the continuity of government as it's being used here in 2022, and how it has that real close relationship with the UFO file. And I'm going to describe why it is related to space, especially now, because they've taken those secrecy rules that they developed for that underground government, which they built to withstand a nuclear attack back during the Cold War, and they expanded those rules during the 1980s to include any emergency. That was a big change. And the people that were involved were Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld, Vice President George Bush, who became president. Of course, his son was president. And also Ollie North, who is a very interesting figure in that whole setup, because he would, in fact, use that COG, what they call the Doomsday Communications Network, to sell those arms to Iran and divert the money to the Contras. And the way that he did that was by using this secret means of communication. Now, one of the things in any of my work on continuity of government owes the biggest debt to Professor Scott, Professor Peter Dale Scott, who is a Berkeley professor out there on the left coast. And it's very interesting because you can see how the right-left thing goes out the window, because here's someone who's very much on the left side but can see this exactly right. And but his work is so detailed. And some of the work that I've brought forward was to try to mix this sort of black budget world with his revelations around continuity of government. Once in a while, I see a bastardized version of this using the continuity of government language to suggest that Trump is still in power and still controls everything. I'm going to show that that's highly in error. He's trying to get back in power. And if anything, the continuity of government program was used against him. But we're going to find out something absolutely fascinating tonight, which is, I'm going to call it COG1 and COG2, because in fact, there's a movement there, since they try to exercise this COG of power during Trump's administration to oust him, that in the last 2 months of his administration after the election, he was one of the busiest presidents of all, getting rid of and setting up rules whereby continuity of government could not do what it was attempting to do. Now, continuity of government, I'm going to give a quick history here. This was built up really under Truman and Eisenhower, and they were trying to create a scenario where you'd look at the Cold War scenario and you'd say, well, if the government gets decapitated, literally, we are going to be in a situation where, we won't have the ability to continue. And all they have to do is bomb us in Washington, D.C., and it's all over. So they created this whole structure all over America, and it was large underground bomb structures, basically. But it expanded and it expanded, and Area 51 was part of that. And these are the things that we've watched. A whole underground government got built up. But along the line, they were like, we should really add major secrecy to this, because if the Russians find out, they'll know where to bomb. And the more secret it got, the more of a runaway government it became. And eventually that covert wing of the government, by the time you get to 1963, just flips over and it takes over the overt public version of the government. And we've had a big struggle with them ever since. Now, one of the things that's fascinating about Peter Dale Scott's work is he noticed that in every deep event in American history, from the Kennedy assassination forward, and that includes Watergate, Iran-Contra, September 11th attacks, and some of the things that we're seeing recently, continuity of government personnel were involved. So somehow this doomsday group, the Doomsday Network, has a thread where, their people keep showing up at major events that are unsolved and change policy. So as part of this deep state secret structure, it comes forward, it changes policy, and then it retreats back into the shadows. But the threads and the footprints that we have left all come from this continuity of government group. And that goes all the way back, as I said, to the JFK assassination, which is a crucial deep event because it changes policy for decades and changes the entire direction, not just of the country, but of the world. And we need to keep that in mind. That it is President Kennedy is such a linchpin in all this, because the things he was trying to do were so in opposition to what we got as a ruling structure from the deep state. Kennedy was for freedom. Kennedy was for giving governments autonomy. And he resisted the idea of the military-industrial complex and the Pax Americana of American weapons of war dominating these different regions. He wanted to work it out, and there were forces there that had been in place long before he got there. And they were like, this guy has his own version of reality, and he has his own version of freedom trail and all that. We've been working for 3, 4 decades, 5 decades on this world order, and we're not going to let him get in the way. And by the time he got into wanting to share the UFO file, that was the end for President Kennedy, and the Central Intelligence Agency getting rid of him. And it's that combination of the Central Intelligence Agency with the aerospace wing of the military-industrial complex. This is what we've learned through the people who went through the cases, like Jim Garrison. And it's very interesting because Garrison comes up tonight on the UFO side. Isn't that fun? We're going to get deep into him as well. So interestingly enough, we've seen that Cheney was crucial. And at the time, Cheney was either in private business when he was working on it as part of Halliburton, the oil company that reaped so many rewards during the Iraq War while he was vice president. But before that, of course, he'd been CEO of Halliburton, and then he had been a congressman in Wyoming. So when he got called into work on COG, it was kind of unusual because he wasn't really a major member around defense and all the rest. And that was in the 80s. Then he became defense secretary, but then retired and was CEO, and then called back to work on the continuity of government program. Continuity of government, one easy way to understand it, is an entirely fixed secret structure which has no oversight, and also is budgeted every year, billions of dollars, and has the capacity basically to set up an entirely secret government in the event of a disaster. Now, one of the key changes that took place during the 1980s was that Rumsfeld and Cheney working together, and they will form a sinister duo going all the way back to 1970. But they set up the continuity of government to include new factors, such as rounding up citizens and detaining them, under the guise of, well, if we have a war in Central America, we wouldn't want a lot of protests, that could interfere with the war effort. And that was when the whole 1980s drug running stuff was happening in the Contras and all the rest of it. And we were trying to keep the Russians out of Nicaragua, but the people we were putting in there were part of a big CIA drug running ring, which ruined this country in many ways. And it took a lot to recover from that drug wing. And then now we have the fentanyl thing through China. It's the same type of thing. And that's why they want those open borders so badly. And they suffered, I think, under the Trump administration because Trump was serious about closing the border. And that really interrupted the drug trade massively. So they're playing a lot of catch up now and ruining a lot of lives. But I think what's important to keep in mind is when Rumsfeld and Cheney put these rules in, the other thing that they did was they included a provision that said any emergency was good enough to call continuity of government. It doesn't have to be nuclear. The old rules were nuclear. And actually made sense to a degree because you would need this underground structure to fight your enemy if they were nuking you on the top. But to take it to a different level and say, well, it has nothing to do with the Cold War anymore. It's just if we have an emergency, for example, well, they just called everything an emergency now, right? The COVID op was an emergency. I've been saying they were building up a UFO threat op. That's an emergency for sure. So we're looking at these different types of emergency powers. And at a certain point, they were like, how are we ever going to get to the point where we can utilize this anti-constitutional structure? Emergency powers. And so they went that extra mile there during the 1980s, and they changed COG to include this and the inclusion. And they had an exercise in there called Rex 84, which was all about rounding up citizens. This becomes very important because we all saw during the COVID operation that there were a series of things that came up where they were like, well, we're going to have to put people in these big, facilities. And they got budgeted millions of dollars for this. And in Australia, they utilized it. In Canada, they utilized it. In America, it came up in Tennessee that they were doing it, and there was a lot of outrage. So that they continued building it in the background. But they have these ideas also for mass detention at places like stadiums and Walmarts and things like that. This is all part of the emergency powers grab and the power grab. And we did see a power grab in Canada with Justin Trudeau and Chrystia Freeland. I'm going to show how that all relates to a pattern of emergency powers going on. And certainly the UFO threat is something that they're planning to use, which is why we're seeing them so gleefully embracing it with the CIA UFO threat op. And there's a lot of things that happened in the past week on that we're going to get to as well. Tonight, everybody, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is the special report, Continuity of Government and the UFO File Revealed. No threat there in the UFO. There's no UFO threat. That is really a CIA creation. But the threat is those people utilizing that against a public that is just bemused and bewildered after handling so much government interference in their lives over the past few years. We're going to be taking your questions. I want to remind you in the second half of tonight's broadcast, and you can ask those now. Miss Olivia is going to be taking care of them. Before I jump into Liz Cheney, Miss Olivia, how are we doing out there?
Not good. Sean Jackson says that our feed is getting hammered. So I hope that is not.
Our feed is
getting hammered.
Well, if it's not a pattern, though, it might be just from that particular one, because I'm looking at the other comments and I don't see anything like that.
Let's hope it's not happening to everybody.
Yeah, well, there can always be a little throttling when it comes to getting this stuff out. And I really think that the types of conversations that you and I have here and the ideas from the kinds of things that governments and their censorship agents are not very happy about. And I think it's definitely the type of thing they tried to stop. We saw a lot of the COVID stuff. It was very interesting to read the rules in Australia. In America, of course, they were quite similar, but Australia was unique because they were talking all about, well, make sure if you see someone in the supermarket, you don't stop and talk to them. That's pretty good. Like, just cut off any communication, because God help you if you talk about the government and they're like, hey, yeah, didn't they say there was 2 weeks to flatten the curve? What happened? Well, they kept you in house jail for 2 years instead and closed half of everyone's business. That's a big thing. They don't really want people talking about that unless it's on Zoom and they can track it, right? So we've seen a lot of that. And I think what we have now is they utilized a certain amount of power. I think there were those who thought during the COVID op, we can do this, and I could picture Klaus Schwab back there, like the shock and awe would take them over. But I do feel that they've decided, well, we need to pull in some other factors now. We're going to pull in this situation of a food shortage. We're going to pull in these different aspects of a divided society. We're going to grab the former president and, haul him off in chains to jail. How's that going to look? This is where they're going. And it's very important, I think, to kind of keep our wits about us as we go forward. And believe it or not, I see all kinds of handwriting on the wall as far as the UFO threat aspect goes. Where they take it is going to be pretty interesting for sure. Liz Cheney, this is very interesting. She lost massively her seat in Congress in Wyoming during the primary there, being thumped over 30 points, which is pretty dramatic. That means you're politically useless, especially in your home state. But what's fascinating about this is, as soon as that happened, all the news media was like, Liz Cheney, the next president, could she run? And all this stuff about it. Now, usually when somebody loses by over 30 points, you don't think of them as a presidential candidate, especially from a small state like Wyoming. And especially given her track record of going after her own party, Republicans, be very hard to get the nomination. So what is it that they're talking about? Here's some examples of her going after the GOP. Liz Cheney calls GOP very sick, questions whether party can recover. Liz knows damn well through Dick Cheney all about continuity of government because her dad set it up, after all. Her dad, Dick Cheney, Darth Vader himself, who, really enjoyed bombing the bejesus out of Iraqi citizens for oil interests, he called Trump the biggest threat to the republic ever, which is kind of weird language, just generally, and also as another Republican. But he was out there, and I started to put the dots together about the COG aspect concerning this, because I said, we know that she knows she's headed for a fall in this primary. So what are they doing with the presidential thing? And it's all the liberal media pushing the presidential part. Here's another thing. Liz Cheney considering presidential run after losing Wyoming GOP primary. See how that doesn't work? Like, I win and then I think about getting the presidency, not I lose 30 points and I think I can make it to president, even though I just lost as a congressperson. Doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, does it? So what is it that they're working on? Cheney's defeat comes with a major silver lining, the media says. Really? What's that silver lining besides the $50 million she has? Well, she started to talk about how we've just begun and, we're going to be doing all this. And I believe what she's talking about is being a major player when the COG powers are enacted. And this is how I think we can read between the lines here. I'm going to give you a small snippet, biographical snippet, that Dick Cheney wrote when talking about 9/11. And here he says, the U.S. government was functioning. The president was safe. The attack had not succeeded in shutting us down. Speaking of 9/11. Which, as we know, there's so many questions about 9/11, and to take it seriously on face value is ridiculous. The idea of somebody in a cave with cell phones directed a bunch of box cutters to take down the United States air defense system, which the Russians and the Chinese and nobody else could have done through all those years, but somehow these guys were able to do it. And this story and the idea that they probably used remote control planes. That's one aspect that I think is important. But the other aspect that I think is crucial is that you can't fly a plane into the Pentagon. There's a lot of weird things in relation to 9/11, but that one always stands out because you can't get near the Pentagon. They have their own sort of air defenses, and it's just never going to happen. One of the interesting things that happened after this explosion took place there is Donald Rumsfeld, who's the defense secretary, who, during a time when a terrorist attack is occurring, there are rules about a defense secretary. They need to go into this secret structure and plan with the president and all this stuff. And what does he do? He shows up on the lawn of the Pentagon, taking someone out in a stretcher for the ultimate photo op, right? Just would never happen. So there are a lot of weird things about 9/11. I have a whole collection around it from my conversations with Jim Marrs and Peter Dale Scott, and it's pretty well identified that they selected the designated culprits, all of Lee Harvey Oswald, beforehand, and within something like 20 minutes, they knew, oh, these are the 19 guys you're looking for. One of the ways that they knew that, which always grabbed me as hilarious and absurd on the face of it, is there's an FBI agent walking down the streets of Manhattan, and he sees this piece of paper sort of tumbling in the air, and it lands on top of a pile of rocks from the rubble from the 9/11 towers. And he goes over and he's like, what is this? And he picks it up, and you know what? It's a passport from one of those darn hijackers. Well, that's good and handy he found that, because that helped them put the pieces together. So that's the official story, that an FBI agent found a passport of one of the terrorists on top of that rubble. So you can see the nature of this is farcical. But it's dangerous, too, because like the Kennedy assassination, it sits out there swinging in the breeze, and the credibility of the whole nation swings with it. But they were able to amass mighty changes, including the September 11th emergency structure that we live under now, from which they can call continuity of government. And we know the continuity of government was enacted by Dick Cheney on September 11th. And that's how you get the Patriot Act and all those wonderful things like the TSA. But anyway, here is our friend, Dick Cheney, as vice president speaking. As we watched television reports in PEOC, it seemed that none of the reporters had been in contact with anyone in the executive branch who could talk authoritatively about what we were doing. Several members of Congress had been on the air, but they were all removed from the business of actually running the country. Someone needed to make a formal statement to the nation, and I knew it couldn't be me. My past government experience, including my participation in Cold War era continuity of government exercises, had prepared me to manage the crisis during those first few hours of 9/11. This is important because he's been identified in many different ways as running the continuity of government program, but that's his only actual admission of being involved with it. So it gives us that background. And indeed, he went off and used the Doomsday Network during 9/11 and then took off into a mountain bunker and came out a month later with the Patriot Act. And that's something. Good old Dick. But his daughter now, she wants to be president after losing in a big thud by 30 points. So what kind of presidency is she talking about, since she's going after Republicans, and the Democrats surely wouldn't accept her with all of her conservative credentials, but they are pushing her, and they're pushing this whole idea. What are they talking about? Well, let's look for the whole kind of crowned COG queen idea. Let's get that COG thing going. The emergency powers, they need people on the top of that structure. And one of the things that we know, I was looking at this, I wanted to get this security classifications down exactly right. So I got the list. And I want to say how this list only makes sense under certain situations. I'm going to explain that. This is the actual succession in the case that they lose the president. And it's the vice president, then it goes to the Speaker of the House, which is Nancy Pelosi, as we know. The President of the Senate, Secretary of State, Secretary of Treasury, Defense, Attorney General, and online down it goes, right down to the Secretary of Homeland Security. Now, However, continuity of government works entirely differently. And I want to really show how the Democrats at the end of the Trump administration were pushing the idea that Nancy Pelosi was going to become president as a result of this when they called continuity of government. That's not the way that it works. In continuity of government, the line of succession goes directly to the Northcom commander. And the Northcom commander is the combatant commander of the United States. He takes over and runs martial law in America. That's the way that it would work. So if they called this emergency, that's what we would get, in fact, not Nancy Pelosi or even the vice president at this point. So let's go back. I want to prove this up because, I get emails from time to time from people who say, I don't remember them trying to do continuity of government during Trump. And I can appreciate it because actually a lot of it was scrubbed from the internet. And when I went back to find some of it, I was shocked because many of the stories I had bookmarked weren't there anymore. But I had saved a number of them in any case. This is from October 4th, 2020, when Trump announced, I have COVID, right? And they were deciding at this point, can they utilize continuity of government to oust him and do that whole thing? Or should they go with this whole mail-in ballot thing? Secretly, this summer, the White House beefed up planning if Trump got COVID-19. A hospitalized president, a continuity crisis. There it is in October of 2020. Let's go further still. Pelosi, continuity of government in place after Trump tests positive. Here she is. And again, the presumption here that she's working with is she's going to be president. That's not how continuity of government works. The idea being, if Trump and Pence were, both got COVID, then she would take over. No, actually, interestingly enough, the Northcom commander would, General Van Herk. And that still is the case today if they press the button on continuity of government for any reason. And by the way, one of the things that they've included in that and talk about quite often is a cyber attack. Oh, the Russians are cyber attacking us. We need continuity of government. There's a lot of different reasons that they could call it out. And having a weak, senile president in Stepford Biden the way we do now, it's kind of ideal for them to be looking at this. But here's the rest of that article from Pelosi. Reuters, U.S. House of Representatives Speaker Nancy Pelosi said that plans for continuing the government should President Donald Trump become incapacitated remain in place. Pelosi said she'd been tested and would know the tests of her own results and blah, blah, blah. And then in the article, it goes, the Democratic speaker is next in the line of succession after Vice President Mike Pence. And it's very interesting. They're ignoring the Northcom takeover guy. Now, in terms of these articles disappearing, I'm going to show this one because this article disappeared. It was from Yahoo. And it says, an exhausted Trump's long path to coronavirus. Questions of government continuity arose in ways that haven't in years. Trump's diagnosis amounted to the most serious health threat to an American president. And this is the whole article there. Now, what's interesting is you can try in 90 different ways to get the actual article, and you can't. But the leftover is there, that little vestige of what they were trying to do and the explanation of the article. When you go there, it'll just blow you into wide open random Yahoo-ness. And I've tried a number of different ways to get that original article, but this is what they were pushing. And there was a reason why they were doing this. Now, the continuity of government structure would place us under Northcom, but it would also give us regional governors, and the regions would be taken over by different military officials through Northcom, and they would divvy up resources and things of this nature. Now, I'm not saying this to scare us and to be like a fear porn thing. What I want to do is give us that clear outline of what they're talking about when they get to emergency powers. And I'm going to show where they were going to exercise emergency powers, and they've had dry runs of doing this. And one of those places is Australia, and it's very interesting because those things are breaking right now. Actually, I'm not going to wait another second to get into that section, but before I do, we're going to ask Miss Olivia how it's going out there. How's the temperature?
This is a good question.
Yeah.
Definitely, Liam McGregor, Daniel, is going to COG, which is obviously more militaristic setup because of JFK's preference for DIA over the CIA?
No, although Kennedy did beef up the ability because of the tensions that were going on with Russia for us to survive a nuclear war. It's true, although he kept lowering the temperature on that and did actually bend over backwards to kind of keep things with Khrushchev on a workable level. His generals really wanted the confrontational thing going on.
Let's continue with that. S Space Ghost says COG sounds like military to me, not deep state. And Larry Light says, DJ, how will COG use the military if we get massive defections? Bring in outsiders? I'm assuming like UN troops.
This is the interesting thing. Professor Scott makes a good point about this, which is COG in and of itself is just a structure. And that network, the secret network, the Doomsday Network, can be used by good people or bad people. But if it gets in the wrong hands, as it has in the past, we've seen, in Kennedy's case, Winston Lawson was the Secret Service agent who used the Doomsday Communication Network for Dallas for setting up the route that they were on. So he was a clear case of somebody from that Doomsday Network who came in and participated in the deep event of Kennedy's assassination. Also had a lot of sketchy recollections that were completely untrue about the incident of the assassination. When you go to Watergate, you're surrounded by COG people. John Dean, who is Nixon's lawyer, he had just come out of continuity of government, and his girlfriend had also worked in continuity of government. One of the main Watergate burglars had just come out of the COG. So we're seeing these people around these events. Then when you get to 9/11, you've got Rumsfeld and Cheney who set the structure up, restructured it in the 80s, and they're utilizing it and calling COG when you get the September 11th attacks. So, throughout American history, if you look at Iran-Contra or the October surprise, when they told the Iranians, don't return those hostages because we'll give you a better deal, that's all COG Communications Network people involved. So Iran-Contra, they're utilizing, and the Iran-Contra is very little understood, but it's a massive fraud, and it is also diverting directly. So it's giving these missiles to Iran, which is an enemy, and it's saying the proceeds from those missiles, which we're collecting, we're going to give to the people we're supporting in Central America, the Contras, to fight the Nicaraguan government because the Nicaraguan government is being Russian friendly. But Congress had cut off funding for those Contras because of a series of things. One, they were involved in drug running, and two, they were involved in different types of atrocities. And I'm sure the people fighting with them were too. It was just a mess. But nonetheless, like it or not, the Congress had cut off the funding. So to do this, to sell American arms to Iran, which was an enemy, and then take the money and give it in the back channel to a group that we were trying to support in this other country, it was all CIA, Ollie North, Bush, and that whole activity. And a lot of people went to prison as a result. And the whole idea was, did Reagan know about it or did he not? And from my own study of it, he didn't. And the whole operation was run through George Bush. But what's interesting is one of the things about Iran-Contra is it started a big flow of money fraud again. So the question had always become, what did they need all that money for at the time? And it's come up in different lines of research that they were using the UFO threat idea on Reagan because they had shown him some very unusual NASA footage of these ships, and these ships were fueling off the rings of Saturn. And, there's a whole thing about Norm Berglund, and he came out saying, I was the scientist who did this and all the rest. And I think it's absolutely true. Now, the thing is, out of that, Reagan starts talking about what if we had an alien threat, and we find out years later from Mikhail Gorbachev, they sit together and talk at Reykjavik, and Reagan asked him, look, will you help us in the event of an alien attack? This is what he's looking at. And of course, this is a very important figure and point that this is a point I make when it comes to the presidents of America and Russia meeting, which is the CIA. It's their worst nightmare, because if those guys get together and talk about the UFO file, the CIA is cut out of the loop and they can't afford that. So they freaked out on a number of occasions, JFK with Khrushchev, Reagan with Gorbachev, and particularly Trump with Putin. They don't want those guys getting together and talking the UFO file president to president. They always want these things that are involved. So there's a lot of that involved. If we look at it, the kind of COG corruption that leans over, and then you're like, why are they using that level of corruption? Are they just using it for some criminal enterprise? Well, the things that they're doing are anti-constitutional, like selling missiles to an enemy, for example. But when you get to September 11th, when they use COG, that's their dry run. They're like, let's see how this works. And, here's an actual situation. And on the surface, you say, oh, it's a terrorist attack by these planes. Although anybody logical looking at that, taking the time to go through the 9/11 event, it's just not believable. So whatever it was that was going on, maybe the anticipated attack and simulated one, there's just a lot of unanswered questions about it. Some of the things that I've heard that are convincing is that they had so much in the black budget that they needed to put on budget that they decided this was the big way for them to do that, because otherwise everybody was going to jail. And we know that Rumsfeld was talking about missing money the day before, and we've had Catherine Austin Fitz's study on this. So we're well educated on that front of things. But the question is, this deep state structure, which is committing these different acts, and the deep events that they're committing always seem to involve the COG people. So it seems like the deep state and the COG thing is a lock. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take that deep state research, and now I'm going to introduce the UFO file aspect as we look at it, because COG is becoming very relevant when we look at the fact that Cheney's daughter is the one that they're touting as a president when she has absolutely no support, either Republican or Democrat. What's going on there? Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. We're going deep here tonight on this special report. This is the continuity of government and UFO file revealed. We're going to be taking your questions in the second half of the program. It's a great crowd out there tonight. And I want to remind you to sign up for our newsletter. If you're new, especially make sure that you go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for that newsletter. That's a free newsletter, but it lets you know the incredible shows that we have coming up. And, sometimes the social media companies don't give the notifications. I hear it all the time.
Sometimes. All the time.
So, and we know there's lots of censorship. My God, the stories go on and on about it. But I don't really even worry about it, because I'll use the networks as long as they're here. And I love, being here with you on YouTube and anywhere else that we broadcast. So we're going to keep, of course, we'll keep doing that. All right, Miss Olivia, before I go.
There's great questions already, but it's going to take us down.
All right, well, throw one in, and we'll let off the steam valve.
Chris Lothian, why would they want to go to COG if it serves their purpose better to keep up the pretense of a civilian government? We all know that Biden's not in charge of anything.
Oh, I would agree with you that, see, the thing is with the exit of the Trump administration, during that election, though, they thought they were going to lose. They were convinced they were going to lose unless they did something. So COG was on the table. That was one of the options that was rolled out on that side. They went with something else. But this other idea of just having the emergency takeover, I'm going to show you through the figure of the former Australian Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, exactly how this operates and how that centralization can work for them to take over. Because remember, they want to reset. Well, part of that reset is just to do away with the Democratic Republic government and just install a thing through emergency powers. I've stated on this program before that people like Biden, people like Trudeau don't have enough actual popular support to govern. Biden swims around in 32% approval. What's his name? Castro boy. Trudeau is beneath 30%. And, so these people don't have the ability to get votes to govern, and the audience is turning on them. And that includes the media. We see them firing left and right, all these. Who did they fire? Brian Stelter. That's a long train coming. But, the thing is, when you get to it, they just don't have the support. So what do you do? Well, you can cook up a lot of support. You can cook up the idea of support. I mean, look at the way they're doing the Liz Cheney thing. She just lost by 30 points, like 62-30 or something. That's embarrassing. But they're like, you should run for president.
Normal people with normal insecurities and self-consciousness would quit. They go to other careers, but no, they double down, they triple down, they stay in there.
The red carpet to the White House is waiting, baby. Dick Cheney and COG.
It tells you that they're made of something completely different from the rest of us.
Well, there's a lot of truth to that. I'm after we get through this Morrison thing, I'm going to give you something special on that. But let's do the Morrison thing because I think it's significant in demonstrating how COG works and may answer that last question. All right. So Scott Morrison was extremely unpopular during the lockdowns because of the fascist abilities that he exercised there in Australia. And they had tremendous problems with him, kind of worse, I think, than any other country. If you think even of like France and other places like that, they had their problems. But Morrison had just some of the most jackbooted lockdown policies that were beyond bizarre. But that was a real tryout for this New World Order structure. Okay, but something happened. So he lost the election because of his unpopular policies, but he still remained a member of parliament. Well, interestingly enough, recently some things came out about what he was doing as prime minister, and watch how the emergency powers operate because it's very instructional. Secret powers of an Australian prime minister now revealed. This is New York Times. Even they have to turn this guy in. Scott Morrison was busy during the pandemic. In addition to being prime minister, he covertly put himself in charge. Covertly, remember, that's in secret. Put himself in charge of 5 ministries. That's like saying, I'm defense secretary, I'm treasury secretary, I'm housing secretary, I'm secretary of state and president too, but I'm not telling you. Critics say he damaged democracy. Okay. Let's go with this a little bit. Australian slam former leader for secretly taking 5, count them 5, cabinet jobs. So this is the consolidation of all those jobs into one person. So therefore, if I make a move and I say, well, I have this new COVID policy and I'm calling martial law, basically, there's nobody in the cabinet to disagree because I have all the jobs. And that's exactly how it worked. This is the guy going off to have a cabinet meeting. I kid you not. He's having a cabinet meeting with himself. So he's taking his meeting notes there, and he's like, I can't wait to be there to greet myself.
It's like a Monty Python sketch.
It really is. Scott Morrison, Australian ex-PM, resists pressure to step down because he's still in Parliament. He's still a member. Former Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison has resisted calls to resign from Parliament after news emerged that he'd secretly assumed 5 additional roles during his tenure. And again, he did it in secret, so nobody knew. That's our friend Morrison. That's why Australia got so screwed up. Scott Morrison's ministerial grab holds lessons beyond Australia. You bet your life it does. These people can just do this in the background, sign a secret note covertly, and suddenly, voila, I have 5 different positions. Can you imagine Stepford Biden being like, I'm defense secretary? All right. Here's a little bit from that article on Morrison. That's not my job was uttered so often by Scott Morrison in his final months as Australia's prime minister that the phrase became a running joke. As it turns out, he had far more jobs than voters, Parliament, or indeed some of his own cabinet, realized. While in power, Morrison quietly appointed himself to 5 other ministries during the pandemic, in some cases without the knowledge of the relevant ministers. In other words, I'm just doing this. It's got no oversight. Nobody else knows about it. I'm just assuming those jobs. This is how the emergency powers work, because if they were moving to consolidate and take that martial law step, it was up in the air. They were deciding on it, but they needed those positions consolidated. And then he could step forward and do it. There'd be no opposition because he was doing all the jobs. The revelations this week have ignited a firestorm, raising questions of accountability, transparency, and the concentration of power. They are questions not just for Morrison, but also for Australia and other democracies around the world. The pandemic provided the perfect fig leaf for strongmen in more authoritarian systems to amass power. And they go after the Hungary guy because he threw George Soros out. But what we have there is a very clear-cut case. Okay, now let's jump to Canada. In Canada, they did the same thing. They called the emergency powers against the truckers during the trucker protests. And remember, he's operating with under 30% popularity. But interestingly enough, he created a new cabinet position because she was the finance minister, Chrystia Freeland, who used to cozy up to all the Russian oligarchs in the 90s and the early 2000s. And she was a journalist, actually. And here she shows up as this kind of totalitarian dictator along with Trudeau. Very odd indeed, except she's been working on George Soros's biography and working directly with Soros for a decade. So that explains a lot there. But here's what's interesting that they did. They created a new position, and the position was Deputy Prime Minister. So here we have them again, sort of, giving her 2 jobs, just like Morrison is picking up jobs. And the idea is, if I have enough phony positions, I can consolidate this thing. Now, it's interesting because I'm going to show where Trump also realized that this was happening and tried to amass a version of shattering that system and also figuring out how he could advance his own programs through very shady means as well. But it's very interesting the way that he was doing it because, again, and this is part of the intense hatred on behalf of the establishment for Trump, which is he knows the keys to the deep state because of his association with Roy Cohn, who basically was one of the big architects of the deep state. And so, some people say, well, that says a lot about Trump. Well, it shows an interesting thing about Trump, whether regardless of your stance on him, it shows that he knows. So if you think he's a good guy and he knows, I guess that's good. If you think he's a bad guy and he knows, that's not so good. But he knows. He knows about the UFO file and through his uncle, and he knows about the X technology through his uncle and the Tesla transfer there, which we did an episode on last week. And we got some great feedback on that episode because I think people are really starting to get some of the work that we've been putting out there around this. And I would tell you, I couldn't believe the date on the Tesla Trump and the time capsule, which contains a lot of that information. That's from 2018.
Amazing.
It shows you the thread of how this unwinds. And, I've talked about that in relation to Nixon. And this is very interesting about Nixon as well, because people didn't realize that relationship between Nixon and Trump. So therefore, a lot of the things that we were talking about early in the X series went over people's heads because it was like, well, how do you know that Trump had this relationship with Nixon? By the time the Nixon Library released those records in September of 2020, then everybody knew. But, that's the thing, which is you need that information, you need it early, and you need that insight. But that relationship was very clear for a long time. And there's deeper aspects because, as we talked about on the previous program, there's Nixon's UFO letter, the time capsule, and the Robert Merritt story hanging out there and becoming all the more strange and strangely relevant after the FBI raid. So now that story rings heavy. And I said I took this story as far as I could, and Merritt, the whistleblower on that, who was a member of the Houston plan, who claimed he'd met with Nixon, and Nixon wanted to keep this UFO letter as a time capsule for when disclosure came out, and had him deliver a copy to Henry Kissinger and said he was going to hide one in the White House. All that's very, very interesting. And we took it to where it would naturally go. But the idea of Reagan and Nixon and some of these presidents being deeply involved with disclosure makes a lot of sense because a lot of them were behind UFO documentaries. They had whole programs for getting this information out. So each president, when they get in there, they think, I might be the one, and I might be the one who goes on the record with this. One of the sleazier things that I saw was during the Obama administration, he actually shut down a lot of UFO research. and didn't advance the space program. It's a weird presidency. In fact, it's kind of the clerk for the bankers presidency, and let's take over Libya and bomb 10 countries in the Middle East presidency. Obama's a real interesting twist, and that might be a person who wanted to do something differently, and but nonetheless, the record of that presidency is bizarre in how aggressive it is on a militaristic basis, and also how, keeping those financial people who had caused the 2008 financial crash, so just supporting them. And it's a very Obama's presidency, it needs to be looked at very deeply, because it promises one thing and becomes just such a weird charade. But what's interesting about him is that as soon as they started talking the UAP stuff, and during that came out through all the things that they're doing in the media about this, trying to make UAP, this whole thing, as a replacement for the UFO file, because it's a CIA press directive. It's a press push. It's a PR move. It's where Lou Elizondo comes from, Chris Mellon, all that stuff, the TTSA. Those are all CIA structures on the record. It's very important to understand their promo moves. And that's really where it was at. But what's interesting, if you look at the Obama presidency, is he came out and started talking about, last year, oh yeah, there are UFOs, there is all this stuff. And he starts getting on board after really shooting the topic down for 8 years as president. So there's something very disingenuous about him suddenly jumping on board. Speaking of disingenuous, I've got a pair of disingenuous guys I want to point out here. And this one really gets me, because Ronald Moultrie, who's a Department of Defense guy who came before Congress during those UFO hearings and sat there with a congressman scoping out plans and ideas for how they could punish amateur interest groups who were studying UFOs. This is what they were talking about. How can we punish them? That's a really good question, Congressman. Maybe we can get together in secret session and talk about that. No, maybe you won't, because that's not constitutional. Ronald Moultrie, NASA Administrator Bill Nelson, and I are looking forward to our teams collaborating on an unidentified phenomenon. We greatly appreciate all that our NASA colleagues are doing in the areas of science and exploration, right? And that's Bill Nelson, the senator from Florida and former astronaut. Very interesting, odd program they announced there at NASA. I'll get into that in a minute. But here's Darren LaHood, who was sitting there and specking this out with our friend Moultrie about how we can punish people basically for picking up a UFO book. It's very strange. And the idea being that basically the government version of this should be the only version. Well, when I went into LaHood's past, it was quite fascinating, because LaHood had spent many, many years as the U.S. attorney in Las Vegas. That gave him dominion over Area 51 and a number of those secret programs. So this guy is coming from a place of UFO secrecy immediately. He's an Illinois congressman now. And I would say he's one to watch. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show, going deep, deep tonight on the continuity of government program, UFO File. So many great friends with us here tonight in the Ideas Room. And you bet I'm going to shout you out at the end of the show. But Miss Olivia, before I get into stage 4, DEF CON 2, what do you got?
David Tormita, DJ, isn't it true that Obama's actually a cousin to Dick Cheney?
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
That's interesting. There was this 12-year-old genius girl, and she figured out all these different relationships to presidents. And the bloodline, in fact, showed Cheney and Obama were related. That tells you a lot. And I'm going to get into a bloodline piece. That might actually set this up quite well.
Okay.
Prepare to be amazed, delighted, confused, and mystified. Now, on this program, Ernest Hemingway becomes a very important figure in relation to the Hot Zone and his searches in relation to Atlantean artifacts, and how I believe he was part of an early intelligence network along with John F. Kennedy and Thomas Townsend Brown. I've been calling that the Hot Zone Network. And it has roots that go all the way back to 1930. And a lot of this, I'm going to have a X series Hot Zone show probably for Labor Day or somewhere that weekend, and that will be the one that's going to have this. But anyway, you're going to get a sneak preview of what's going on here. Okay. At the end of his presidency, Trump was running around firing people. It's an interesting thing to do. But he was also reshuffling people and changing personnel dramatically, especially in that secret structure around the continuity program. He had realized, I believe, that the continuity guys, part of the thing that had happened what happened in August of 2020 was that the combatant commander got switched out. And he got switched out for Van Herk, who has the UFO connection because he's part of the 509th group, which is the same group that found the Roswell wreckage. Well, he's a very interesting character on his own, and I have a few things here about him also. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to show how Trump was working to figure out what had gone on there and his attempts to enact this National Security Action Memorandum that JFK had left behind that constrained the CIA, which is NSAM 57. Now, here's what happened. Trump's going around through the Defense Department. He's going around through intelligence. He's going around through Homeland Security, and he's finding out all of these kind of weak links and all these COG people that are collaborating with each other. And what he sends in, he wants somebody to go in there who doesn't know anything about those people. And he wants to send them in there bright-eyed and bushy-tailed to remove them and replace them with other people. Now, here's what's fascinating. The people that he sends in to change them are college students. And they get these incredibly high appointments at the end of the Trump era. Now, one of them, and I have to introduce him as kind of a mystery person. I don't want to suggest anything sinister about him. I want to suggest him in almost the opposite fashion, as someone who's very interesting and keeps a very mysterious profile online, including the fact that you cannot find his picture anywhere, even though he's listed as a member of the Defense Department. His name is John Troop Hemingway, which is the original spelling of Hemingway. And I'm going to show how that Troop Hemingway is an interesting signal. Here's the White House Presidential Personnel Office, and he's listed in March of 2020 at the University of Virginia, age 21. John Troop Hemingway. And then at the top of this structure of young college guys going in there and changing things up, he puts in somebody else, John McEntee, who also has a very interesting history. And some of these people are picking up on it at the end. Trump just put a 29-year-old fired over allegations of financial crimes in charge of all personnel decisions. Underline all, everything. This guy is the person that Trump gave it to. And he's another one in this group. Now, when I went looking for deeper information on Hemingway, it's not easy to get, in fact. But if you look, for example, he's a Claremont Fellow, and this is a conservative kind of university group that gets together to make change and all the rest, and their future congressmen and people like that. Here we go. Troop Hemingway, T-R-O-U-P, was most recently working for the Trump administration and previously served on the policy team for the Trump campaign. So he goes all the way back to 2016, which means he would have been, I think, like 18 years old. He has worked in the White House Presidential Personnel Office as well as the Pentagon on the Secretary's staff and the Office of the White House Liaison. He also served to structure under the new Undersecretariat for Research and Engineering. This is interesting, too, because he has a technology job, basically. Trump has a bachelor's degree in cybersecurity from the University of Virginia. Graduating summa cum laude, he is currently involved in the Boundary Channel Partners and the Association of Republican Presidential Appointees. Interestingly enough, no picture. Everyone else, and I mean everyone else in Claremont in that think tank, has a picture, but Hemingway's picture is missing. It's a missing. Let's go a little bit deeper on our friend. Troop Hemingway. John Troop Hemingway, who actually I found out is John Troop Calhoun Hemingway. And one of the things I've pointed out about Hemingway is the whole Hemingway family comes out of this Hemingway, and somehow they dropped the G and changed the spelling along the way, or they added the G and they dropped the E for an I. So we have this Hemingway turns into Hemingway. And if you walk around here in Harvard Square, you're going to see Hemingway Gymnasium, the Hemingway Center, Hemingway this, Hemingway that. And if you go downtown Boston to the Symphony Orchestra, you're going to find yourself on Hemingway Street. That's because the Hemingways had that incredible impact when they came here. Okay, John Troop Hemingway has been hired on a 30-day detail to help the deputy director of the Presidential Personnel Office, again, at the end of the Trump administration. Hemingway is expected to graduate from the University of Virginia in December. Hemingway, who's in his 20s and started last week, is the third college senior to be hired in short order by the White House. One administration official praised him by saying, he's really good at what he does. Whatever that is. James Bacon, 23 and a senior at George Washington University, was hired to be one of McEntee's right-hand men. McEntee, again, remember, he's young also. He's 29, and he is on top of this whole student strategy. And all of these students and McEntee are going through the Defense Department and all personnel, and they're switching people out, firing them, and replacing them with other people at the end of the Trump administration. Now, here's a couple of things to keep in mind. Mark Esper is the defense secretary at that point. Trump fires him 2 days after the election, which is a weird thing to do because he's a defense secretary. You would think he goes down with the administration, he recycles. But Trump gets rid of him, and one of the things that he did is he hired Van Herk and got rid of the other COG commander. When they tried in October for the continuity of government thing through Pelosi and what we went through earlier, it appears to me that Trump caught wind of what was going on and kept command, but realized the people who had tried to oust him through COG. This becomes very obvious when you see the fast changes. I don't think anyone was busier than President Trump at the end of his administration, because usually lame duck presidents at the end just worried about their legacy and, can I get financing for my library and that kind of thing. They don't really engage in this kind of hyperactivity of going through each agency and eliminating people and putting in other people. And this is part of the problem that the Biden administration had with the Space Force, because the Space Force, which again is an effort by the executive branch to retain that UFO file back, because if I create a Space Force and that's a division of the armed services, well, that supersedes any kind of, aeronautics or aerospace company that's holding that. I now have possession of that UFO file. This is where the Space Force comes out of. So, when we're looking at that, when Biden gets in, they don't do much with the Space Force because it's honeycombed with all the people that Trump put in. All right, we'll just go a little further with this. Hemingway, who worked on the Trump campaign in 2016, again, he had to be 18 years old, got his start in the Trump administration when he was on the beachhead transition team at the Department of Defense, then worked at the Department of Defense White House Liaison Office. According to an administration official, at various points during his time at the Defense Department, Hemingway was working to finish his degree, according to two administration officials. He worked for the Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering. Again, there's the technology piece. I looked up John Troop Calhoun Hemingway to find out how much they were paying him and all kinds of good stuff. And again, those articles zooming around at the very end of the Trump administration, why are 3 college seniors in influential White House posts? 3 weeks ago, we learned an undergraduate student was hired for an influential White House post. Evidently, he wasn't the only one. These stories were going around. This gets into COG1, COG2. And one of the things that Trump realized was that they had worked the COG thing and that he had avoided them doing this. This is how it appears through that October now of 2020. Esper, as I said, Trump fired, who had hired Van Herk. Now, interestingly enough, I went through a lot of different research about John Troop Hemingway. And Hemingway, I found out that family is a very interesting way to track them all across the country and the various interests that they were involved in, including Hemingways themselves being close with the Edgar Casey's family and all of the strangeness there about Bimini and Ernest Hemingway, and also very big up here. But one thing that's interesting is John Troop Hemingway was also an early, with the exact same name, was also an early artist here at Harvard. And then he died young, and his parents had this big system. Then I found out that Troop Hemingway Payne, or Payne Hemingway, was also a major family link around this, using that exact name. And the Paynes, of course, linked up with the Forbes, and that's how you got
Oh my God.
Michael Payne and Ruth Forbes, and that's where we get that whole thing when we get to the strangeness around the JFK situation. But what's interesting for me is when we look at this, we have this very unknown undergraduate who is making these personnel changes along with this other guy, and the other guy, he is in charge of all personnel at the end of the Trump administration. And the switch out is pretty hardcore. In the middle of all that, they activate JFK's National Security Action Memorandum 57, using Ezra Cohen to do that. And that says, as of January 7th, the CIA no longer has the ability to do covert operations, and that all goes to the DOD, and the CIA becomes a support situation that feeds info to the DOD. Now, I found out that Biden went in and changed a number of things as soon as he got in all those departments, and I'm sure they got rid of JFK's NSAM, which Trump basically activated just for that one short period. But here's an interesting thing about John Troop Hemingway, is that he was a member of the Knights of Pythias. And when I said there was something interesting about this Knights of Pythias, something about the Knights of Pythias is they, FDR was a member, and he joined in 36. That's after he's president. They're a very interesting organization, and it kept sounding like a Masonic organization, except there's no links to the Masons. Let's get a little bit on them. The Knights of Pythias is a fraternal organization and secret society. Founded in Washington, D.C. on February 19, 1864, the Knights of Pythias is the first fraternal organization to receive a charter under an act of the United States Congress. That's deep. It was founded by Justice Rathbone, who had been inspired by the play by Irish poet about the legend of Damon and Pythias. And this legend is interesting, too, because it's all about, there's evil emperor who is blaming Pythias for a series of things that have gone wrong. And Damon is this friend who comes forward who wants Pythias to give Pythias the ability to go home and make, everything right with his family and his home to prepare to come back. And the idea is, the emperor says, "Are you kidding? If I let him go, he'll just run." And Damon says, "I'll stand in his stead," showing true friendship and all this whole thing. And in fact, Pythias does return, and the emperor is shocked that he displays all of this, even though he's under threat of execution. And then he lifts the execution order on Pythias and tries to become friends with these two. It's a weird story. But the order has over 2,000 lodges in the United States and around the world, and a total membership of over 50,000. Now, some lodges meet in structures referred to as Pythian Castles. I'll tell you what's fascinating about this on a few levels is the namesake of this person who Trump is running around with at the end of his administration, switching out all of these potential COG people and replacing them. The namesake was from Scotland. And the order has a big Scottish overhang. So instantly got me thinking about Trump in relation to this secret society. But here's the real clinker. The other piece associated, the other major member in history is Nelson Rockefeller. He's a member of the Knights of Pythias. So you've got Trump, FDR, Trump's friend here, and Troop Hemingway, and this whole thing, and all around the Knights of Pythias, which is a Scottish mystery school which is like a Masonic school, but it's not actually a Masonic school. So we have a kind of an interesting mystery there with the Knights of Pythias. And we have to think, what does President Trump and FDR and Nelson Rockefeller all have in common? Well, it's very interesting to contemplate. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're going deep, deep tonight on the continuity of government program COG1, COG2, and the UFO file. And the UFO file revealed through this UFO threat activity, which rises to the level of emergency powers, which they've been playing through the media for all it's worth. And for what it's worth, I believe the UFO threat is a card that they're getting very close to using, which is why we're hearing so much about it in the media right now. I did promise you we're going to take questions in the second half of the program, and I'm running a little over. We're definitely going to take questions, though. So let me finish some of these up. And Miss Olivia, how are you doing out there?
Good. Ratboy Genius says Rathbone was in Lincoln's booth at the assassination and was stabbed by Booth.
Oh, really? Mm-hmm. That is fascinating. Wow. Well, I think we're looking at some interesting connections. I think, this Troop Hemingway piece and why he's given so much power is basically a 21-year-old kid at the end of the Trump administration. And there are articles that I've been reading about them, the way that they went in and switched people out. And they were definitely ruthless about getting rid of these people who were honeycombed throughout these different organizations. Now, a story came out recently which connects up to this, and here's how it goes. Trump had created something at the end of his administration, thinking he was going to get reelected, and the idea was, I can get rid of all of these different people who are career bureaucrats in this structure, and part of that is the continuity of government structure. So, scoop, 2024 GOP hopefuls back Trump's plan to purge civil servants. That's right. Trump's going to get rid of everybody. Okay, let's see what he's up to here. Trump need not win his party's nomination nor ever run again for the next GOP president to try to reimpose executive order known as Schedule F. Schedule F. Democrats increasingly concerned are scrambling to block that possibility. These moves follow Axios publication last month. Okay, Axios is a hardcore left-wing publication, and they're always on Trump's heels or anybody else who's not a leftist. Okay, an in-depth series by Jonathan Swan detailing how allies of the former president are already plotting the return of Schedule F in 2025, where Trump reelected. And I'm sure this Troop Hemingway is right in the thick of that. Now, driving the news, 6 Senate Democrats led by Tim Kaine. You remember that wonderful vice president wannabe with Hillary Clinton?
Who remembers Tim Kaine?
Introduced legislation on Tuesday to secure the civil service to protect career officials against future efforts to reimpose deeply controversial Trump-era orders, which were rescinded by President Biden at the start of his term. I guarantee you one of those was NSAM 57. Jerry Connolly, Democrat, Virginia, who chairs the subcommittee overseeing the federal civil service, last week published an op-ed in the Washington Post, Jeff Bezos' CIA rag, calling on Congress to act. He has sought to amend this year's defense bill to prevent a future president from resurrecting Schedule F. Now, let me tell you, every time they want to do something now, they attach it to the National Defense Authorization Act. I want a UFO office and I want to treat them as a threat, and I'm Marco Rubio. I'm going to attach it and I'm going to say, you can't get the $800 billion for the Defense Department unless you give me this office. So now they're doing it with everything. And this guy, Connolly from Virginia, he's doing the same thing. Unless you do Schedule F, I'm going to block the NDAA. It's just being used now as the plaything for anybody who wants anything. If you scream up and down that you're going to block NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act, which, by the way, is the thing that renews the presidential emergency order from September 11th that we still live under, which, by the way, suspends the Constitution. And by the way, presidents from Bush to Obama to Trump to Biden have all signed on to that every year. It's kind of interesting when you think about it. Okay. What we're hearing, former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and Ted Cruz told Axios they support using a measure like Schedule F to reform the federal bureaucracy and strip civil servants from their positions in crucial government agencies. Trump, when he got in there, realized there's a whole structure that prevents you from doing certain things. You can't make certain moves. Now, you might think, oh, his policies were good or bad, but this was a pretty big realization on his part that there's a movement in the Schedule F executive order that he left, which gives him the ability to take some of these out. What he was doing with those students at the end was going through the emergency powers, emergency planning people, and carefully taking them out, along with Esper and all these other people. But he ran out of time, in my opinion, and got locked into the whole "I really won" thing. Okay. So, Florida Governor DeSantis and Senator Marco Rubio, notice the names closely there, Rick Scott of Florida, and Josh Hawley wouldn't speak to Schedule F specifically, but they showed openness to the approach and told Axios they think more needs to be done to hold career officials and federal agencies accountable. Between the lines, those aligned with Trump on Schedule F say the apolitical civil service is a myth and assert that the bureaucracy is stacked with liberals out to block conservatives from exercising policy muscle won fairly in elections. Now, that's a whole left-right thing, but what it really means is that the deep state is honeycombed through these various things. And I don't want to suggest that the deep state is something that resides inside the government only. It's an inside-outside thing. And if we remember the definition from Professor Scott, the deep state is CIA and the Wall Street influence on CIA, the international finance piece. That has to be understood. And then the contracting agencies that the CIA uses, like Booz-Allen and Hamilton. So you got the contractors, you have the Central Intelligence Agency, you have the wealth divisions in Wall Street feeding that Central Intelligence Agency to help set up different businesses in different countries and make sure, well, we just got an oil field going over there in Central Asia, but we don't have any military people there. Okay, we'll create a political event so we can stick some military in there, protect your oil field. This is the nature of that whole system that we're talking about with the deep state. So let's never think, and I've heard this misapplied before, that, oh, it's just a bunch of bureaucrats who never left the government. It's got nothing to do with that. It's not like, oh, they worked at the registry of motor vehicles too long. No, these are people that operate in different levels of public life and private business. So it's not just that you're going to find the deep state in the government. However, the access points might have been something that Trump, having been in there and known a lot about through Roy Cohn and through the UFO file and his uncle, may have known a lot about this structure, and then was pinpointing and doing this unusual activity in the last 2 months of his administration when he was already defeated technically. This says he wanted to make sure when he came back in that, or if he made an attempt to come back in, that these people had been removed and replaced with loyalists. Very interesting indeed. The more we get into that piece of the last 2 months of the Trump administration, the more revealing the whole thing becomes. Schedule F becomes the whole cover story, basically, for what was taking place. And it opens up this whole thing about John Troop Hemingway and what he was doing in there and why he's such a mystery man that I can't even find his picture online. Now, I don't want to say anything sinister about him. I think he was on a mission that Trump gave him, and I think that mission's a very interesting one. But with people like that, like Ezra Cohen, for example, there was something similar going on, and we know all about Ezra Cohen. Hemingway secrecy is most unusual, given the Hot Zone Hemingway shows that we've done and the emphasis around these names. I think it's something we're going to be seeing a lot more of. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. We're going deep tonight into that COG UFO file piece. We're going to be taking your questions shortly. I have a couple of things here to round out the COG part. I guess I have ignored the UFO part, which isn't good. But we're going to be taking your questions here shortly. Miss Olivia, how you doing?
Dr. Joseph Farrell is in the chat.
Yes, Joseph.
And has a question.
Okay.
What does DJ think Mr. Trump was trying to accomplish by all the COG replacements?
I think that he had become aware of the COG plot to remove him. And that's something that we discussed because we remember that very interesting film where Trump came out and you said, there's something interesting going on. And Joseph, you noticed it seemed like the background was moving like he was on a ship, which was a weird thing because he was supposedly getting COVID treatment and all the rest. But something had taken place there. There was some move, and there were a number of articles that came out with Nancy Pelosi talking, oh, yeah, I met with continuity of government yesterday. It's like they were going to move with it, and probably they were trying to see if Pence would go along or something along that line. When this moved into a different phase, and they went with the whole coronavirus mail-in stuff and all the controversy around that, well, it's interesting because the leftovers, Trump was like, oh, this is what they tried to do. I want to go through with a fine-tooth comb and find those people. But the people he sent in to do it, and it is kind of confusing, were totally green. It seemed like they were college students. And one of them was a little bit older. He was like a grad. He had just graduated. And he was 28. He was a grad student. And the methods, but I went through the ages of the different people, and it was basically like 28, 25, 22, and 19 or something. And these stories had spun around that he had got these college kids together. And I wondered if he didn't need this totally blank slate, clear-eyed group to go in there, give them the facts, and not have them have any cross loyalties or let anything get out. And I think he created his own little unit there of doing this, but the replacements are extensive. And I found at least 75, but I hear there's a lot more. So I don't think that's a small amount. And it is, I think it tells us a lot. Okay, a couple of interesting things, and then I'll try to squeeze in Peter Dale Scott's piece and then the UFO piece because that's crucial. New documents illuminate the president's secret unchecked emergency powers. These things tumbled out in May. There was a story, and it was supposedly the Bush Library wanted people to understand all about emergency powers all of a sudden. After hiding the stuff for when was 9/11? 20 years ago? Suddenly, the Bush Library was like, we want everyone to know. Bush-era records released under the Freedom of Information Act raised concerns about the powers presidents might claim during a crisis, from suspending habeas corpus to implementing an internet kill switch. This is very important. They emphasized repeatedly the internet kill switch in relation to all this. I found that interesting because that's something that I think is in their back pocket. And so they say, oh, there's a cybersecurity thing, flip that internet kill switch. And then when we let people back on, it's only good people, it's good people internet. So if you've been associated with calling out the government, or if you've been associated in any way with any kind of radical cause, out you go. There's no internet for you. I think this is something that they're laying tracks for there. And the continuity of government program, the headlines I see over and over again. Here's one relating to the Ukraine now. What is continuity of government, and why does it matter for Ukraine's national resistance? Continuity of government is an American program. So when it gets brought up in a different context, that means they're going global with it. And I think that was part of the Australian prime minister acting like a scumbag. Now, here's a few interesting tidbits along our way. Before Trump left office, there were outliers. There were points of reference that are going to tell us what's going to happen to him when he leaves. And part of it is about this national defense trinket. It's this special piece of classified something that he has. And this one liberal, leading voice is calling it a biscuit. So Mark Ambinder, he goes into a whole thing about these different scenarios with Trump at the end, and what's going on with the transition and Trump not cooperating and all this stuff, which in fact Trump did cooperate. Exactly. He talked a good game on top that, I'm fighting through the courts and all that stuff, but he did everything in the background working so that the Biden administration could take over. But listen carefully to this. This is a tweet now from January 18th, 2021, 2 days before Biden takes over. The end state is continuity of government. Trump's military aide in Florida will probably fly back to D.C. sometime that evening. If Trump doesn't want to give back his biscuit, ... classified as an object at the top secret NC2 ESI FRD level, he becomes liable for its keeping. This is exactly where we are with the FBI raid. This thing, whatever this guy is referencing, January 18th, 2021, is exactly, he knows what's going to happen. How does he know? Well, the word has got out that Trump has something that they want. And he's saying, well, if it ends up that he takes it with him, then it's going to be up to him. It's his responsibility. And if anything happens to it, then damn it, we're going to know who to blame. And, if he has it, then, he's basically, the suggestion here is that he's going to have this thing, this biscuit. And it's so high level important that if he doesn't give it back, then he's responsible for it. And then ultimately the inference is he has something he shouldn't have. They don't say what it is. Let's move to this. Space Force takes over all military satellite communications. That's new. Suddenly, the Space Force, which had been ignored and all this stuff, the Biden administration had these different press people who would actually make jokes about it, like Space Force, ha, 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 even though it was the new branch of the armed services and all the rest. And the Biden administration didn't like it. They even thought about scrapping it, but they couldn't. So they decided to go with it anyway. But now, in a huge reversal around all that, Space Force takes over all the satellites. All military satellites are now under Space Force control. Now, that's interesting for a few reasons. They must have felt confident in doing that. Or this may have been something that Trump built into that system, which is after 18 months of the Space Force, it becomes its own entity. It might be even longer than that. So it's probably, maybe it's like 30 months. So, but whatever it happens to be, there's something going on there with space and the telecommunications. Yes, Miss Olivia.
Red Boy Genius says the MacGuffin is biscuit.
My goodness, as it turns out. But remember who's hanging out in the background? General Van Herk. Hey, it's our Northcom commander. He takes over. He's numero uno if they push the COG button. But remember, he's in charge of NORAD and he's in charge of Northcom. Northcom didn't exist before 9/11, by the way. Now they run us, essentially. So let's get a couple of background pieces. I'm going to squeeze these in before we take questions. This is Professor Scott. I knew I had a lot to get into tonight. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. Great to have you here with us. We're going deep on these continuity of government emergency powers programs and the UFO file. How does the UFO file relate here? I'm going to give you a real interesting early piece of the UFO file. It might explain some things. Watch this, though. This is Professor Scott, who speaks of the deep state and continuity of government, never mentions UFOs. He's a real, political, hardcore analyst and all the rest of it. And I've said this before, that the deep state researchers have so much to teach the UFO researchers. The UFO research field is a disaster in that sense, because they don't understand the whole thing about government secrecy, even though they're in the UFO field. They use it as a tagline once in a while, but they don't understand how assassination or any of these other things work. So you need that deep state knowledge. I think one of the things, there's a big gap right now between deep state understanding, the people who understand the whole Kennedy assassination and its many, all the children of that act, and the deep events that have taken place in American history. And then if you understand that, and then you go into the UFO file, then things open up. But if you just look at the UFO file absent the deep state assassination research, you're lost. And the CIA shows up and says, here's disclosure, here's Lou Elizondo disclosure with Christopher Mellon, the millionaire. Million, that's a good one. And, and this guy comes out and says, oh yeah, I was in the UFO program. I led the program. I was the whistleblower. And then his whole story goes down the drain because it's all, it's more CIA narrative stuff. So the TTSA thing has gone down the drain, but Elizondo and Millen are still out there. All right, Peter Dale Scott. One factor linking Dallas, Watergate, Iran-Contra, and 9/11 has been the involvement in all four deep events of personnel involved in America's highest level planning known since the 1950s as continuity of government, COG. Planning, or more colloquially inside the Pentagon as the Doomsday Project. A few of these actors may have been located at the top as overseers of the secret COG system, and others, including some I shall talk about today, were located further down in the secret communications network. Now, this is a lecture, but a lot of this is in American Deep State, which I think is Professor Scott's best book. I see this planning group as one among many in what I've chosen to call the American Deep State, along with agencies like the CIA and the NSA. And he goes on about powerful banks. But he says, if only one group among many, the COG planning group is also special because of its control of and access to a communication not under government control. That can reach deeply into the U.S. social structure. I discuss these matters at some length in my next book, American Deep State. COG planning was originally authorized by Truman and Eisenhower as planning for a response to a crippling atomic attack that had decapitated the government. In consequence, its planning group contemplated extreme measures, including what Alfonso Ciardi in 1987 called suspension of the Constitution. And yet in Iran-Contra, its asset of a secret communications network developed for the catastrophe of decapitation was used instead to evade an official embargo on arms sales to Iran that dated back to 1979. My question today is whether the network could have been similarly misused in November 1963. And so I'm going to skip the Iran-Contra piece and move to this part because it mentions Cheney. Well, I guess this does include some of that, but it goes into the 9/11 piece. It's certain that the COG emergency network program survived North's demise and continued to be secretly developed for decades at a cost of billions and was overseen by a team including Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld. Now remember, this is them out of government overseeing it and then coming back into government and activating it during 9/11. It's relevant that these two men's presence on the committee spanned three administrations, those of Reagan's, Bush 1, and Clinton, even though at one point under the Clinton administration, neither man held a position inside the U.S. government. They were private citizens running corporations. Such continuity was essential for a group so secret that few records exist even of its activities. We don't know really anything about it. On 9/11, COG plans were officially implemented for the first time by Vice President Cheney and Defense Secretary Rumsfeld. The two men had planned them for so many years. In the case of the JFK assassination, and this is how I'll round this out because I have a JFK piece on the UFO thing. In the case of the JFK assassination, I wish to focus on two men who functioned as part of the communications network of the Office of Emergency Planning, OEP. The agency renamed in 1968 as the Office of Emergency Preparedness, to which James McCord was attached. This is one of the Watergate burglars. He's in the emergency planning. So is John Dean. It was renamed again in 1982 as the National Program Office, for which Oliver North was the action officer. These two men, and there are others, such as Winston Lawson, the Secret Service advance man, who from the lead car in the motorcade was in charge of the Secret Service. That is a shot of Secret Service agent Winston Lawson with President Kennedy. Lawson has drawn critical attention to JFK researchers, both for dubious actions he took before and during the assassination, and also for false statements he made, some under oath. For example, Lawson reported that during the assassination, motorcycles were deployed to the right and left flank of the president's car, which is completely untrue. On the morning of November 22nd, however, the orders had been changed so that the motorcycles rode instead, as Lawson himself testified, just back of the president's car. Captain Lawrence of the Dallas Police testified that the proposed side escorts were redeployed to the rear on Lawson's own instructions. So he knew because he was the one who said, no, place them back there. This would appear to have left the president more vulnerable to possible crossfire. Early on November 22nd at Love Field, Lawson installed what would become the lead car, the base radio, whose frequencies were used by all Secret Service agents in the motorcade. The radio channel operated by the White House Communications Agency was used for some key decisions before and after the assassination, yet its records, unlike those of the Dallas Police Department, channels 1 and 2, were never made available for any investigation. The tape was not withheld because it was irrelevant. On the contrary, it contained very significant information. The White House Communications Office reports to this day on its website that the agency was a key player in documenting the assassination of President Kennedy. However, it's not clear for whom this documentation was conducted or why it was not made available to the Warren Commission, House Select Committee, or the Assassination Records Review Board as it should have been. Well, interestingly enough, Winston Lawson was using that doomsday network when he set up the Dallas motorcade route, and he was using that secret emergency network during the whole assassination process, which was unusual because the Secret Service had their own network. So again, we're left with this question, COG and its personnel involved all the way back to the Kennedy assassination. And when we see Liz Cheney touted as the next president, and we know Dick Cheney set up the 80s version that we have now, which has grown and grown, of continuity of government, we have to start looking at this again. I think someone mentioned the name out there. It's Winston Lawson was the Secret Service agent, Lawson. Okay, I'm going to round this out, which is, a lot of people, I think, generally get this idea, well, the deep state research is one thing, the UFO thing is totally different. So the UFO thing is really out there, and we don't have to include that in the deep state research. And I think a lot of the UFO researchers don't get the basis, the thrust of the Kennedy assassination in relation to the UFO file, which basically, I think the whole secrecy structure is laid bare in the assassination. All right. Lee Harvey Oswald, 15 years old in the Civil Air Patrol. Who did Lee Harvey Oswald work for in the summer before the assassination? He worked for Guy Bannister. Guy Bannister was the head of the FBI office in Chicago. What had been Guy Bannister's role in the FBI before that? He was the person who set up Security Matter X he set up the X files for the FBI, and he was the field agent who would go through the Northwest studying the flying saucer cases. He's shown in newspaper clippings investigating different UFO sightings. He's an ultra right-winger. Oswald is the ultimate communist left-winger and all the rest. The two of those don't make any sense together. In the background, lingering, when Garrison gets his hands on some of this, the DA Jim Garrison, who is the only person to put anyone on trial for the JFK assassination, he feels that Bannister is so important in all this, but he knew Bannister. He actually was an FBI agent at the same time Bannister was and used to have lunch with him, which makes you wonder about Garrison's knowledge around the UFO file. But here's the interesting thing. When he goes and he's thinking about this, he realizes, oh yeah, Bannister died right after the Warren Commission came out. And so he's eliminated very quickly. And he's the one who was using Oswald for a number of different things. And they know that because one of the things that Oswald did was hand out leaflets with this guy's address on it. So I'm sure they weren't too happy about that. It only happened once. Now, the person hanging out in the background when Garrison grabs Clay Shaw and arrests him, the person hanging out in the background is someone named Fred Crisman. Fred Crisman is the first call that Clay Shaw makes when he's arrested by Jim Garrison for the murder of President Kennedy. Crisman was the person involved in reporting the Maury Island case. He was CIA agent all through, he's OSS in World War II, then becomes CIA agent. During the investigation of Maury Island, he goes to Alaska supposedly for a friend's death, but he avoids the whole Kenneth Arnold aspect of this whole thing. And he writes a series of unusual things about these robots attacking him in caves during World War II to these magazines. He's right in the heart of all this thing. At a certain point, he will come out and say to these UFO conferences, you know, the show that's out there, The Invaders, that's my life story. This is what the government did with me. But just from those connections alone, there's a lot to get into. Crisman, of course, you know, was partners with Riconosciuto, who was the father of Michael Riconosciuto, who created the Promise software, and all these connections. But the UFO thing around the deep state piece, it's so there, and it's so easy for us to wrap our minds around if we're just open to putting those pieces together. So when we think about the emergency network and all the politics involved around the continuity of government program, and then we think of the secrecy involved with X-Protect and the UFO file, we can put those things together as a geopolitical whirlwind of which we're existing in. But no one ever talks about either the emergency program or in any authentic way the UFO file in terms of the mainstream media. They just give us the kind of fluff like, oh, hey, Congress is having a hearing on UFOs. Or if they mention the COG network, which used to be completely, you couldn't even mention it in Congress. And then suddenly it was just coming up in articles everywhere. And, you know, the fact that they want to talk about COG and UFO now means to me that the UFO threat could be the piece to activate the continuity of government program. That's how it reads on this side of the fence. And with that, Miss Olivia,
Oh my God,
I turn it over to you.
Where do I start? Okay, well, let's start with the Knights of Pythias. Okay, Mike Jones says the headquarters is in Stoughton, Mass, and it's only 30 minutes to Watertown. Watertown is where John Trump lived.
That's true.
Short Order Cook 1 says the Order of the Knights of Pythias is a partner of the Boy Scouts of America, if that means anything.
That's pretty interesting.
And Esther Taylor says the Rothschilds are Pythias as well.
Oh, okay.
So there's a lot of research to be done there.
Now I think we can start to see why Nelson Rockefeller's in there, because he, you know, FDR was instantly, FDR joined as president. That's kind of remarkable also, because it's not like he gets into these groups to get into power. It's, I'm in power and I want to join your group. That's even more interesting. That reminds me of JFK and RFK joining the Cosmos Club and then resigning very quickly afterwards. So, you know, we're looking at something with these secret societies. The fact that this is not a Masonic group, but it gets congressional approval to open these chapters, I think is significant. And we're going to find a lot of significant people in the heart of it. The only reason it even came up in all of this was because of the John Troop Hemingway person that Trump had hired. He had a namesake. And whenever I find those namesakes, you know, it's interesting that that group, the Knights of Pythias, comes through Stoughton, because again, everything seems to circulate around Boston, interestingly enough. Yes.
Karen Carpenter, is the biscuit connected with what Putin gave Trump?
See, that's very interesting. This person who was, he knew what was going to hit Trump in about a year and 8 months. I think it's very significant. And I think the way he's talking about it is significant. In fact, he's making all of these different classifications. And I wanted to know, I was like, what are the security classifications that he's mentioning versus the things that are coming up? And this is interesting, I think. I found this article by Eric Holdeman called Disaster Zone, Security Classifications Explained. What you need to know about the differences. And then he goes into these different pieces. Top secret will be applied to information in which the unauthorized disclosure could reasonably be expected to cause exceptionally grave damage to national security. Secret will be applied to information to which is the unauthorized disclosure could reasonably be expected to cause serious damage to the national security. Confidential will be applied, and so on down the line they go. My highest level of clearance was top secret SCI, which is explained below. Top secret SCI is on some of those crates and things and boxes that they grabbed of files for Trump. And I was trying to get a drift of where these classifications would reside. Now, we understand high secrecy, nuclear, and all the rest of it, but I was wondering if this guy would give us, because he was so familiar with the terms, a little background. I found this interesting. The reason I had TSSCI clearance was that I worked on a code word project that had to do with continuity of government for our national command authorities. So he's saying continuity of government, the TSSCI, which is on those Trump documents, that's what they use for continuity of government. And I wonder if some of the things that they don't have Trump for are related, one, to the UFO file, and two, the continuity of government. He's putting it directly together that TSSCI clearance is a COG function. But notice also that he says, I worked on a code word project. I found that very fascinating around COG. And SCIF is the other one, Sensitive Compartmentalized Information Facility, to practice decoding messages. Now, so that's Eric Haldeman, and he writes for Emergency Management Magazine. Did you even know there was such a thing? But those security classifications and the levels that they come from are very interesting. And let's not forget this man who created the UFO secrecy wall. That's Vannevar Bush. And who is his protege? It's John Trump. So then the security clearances, the classifications, the things about Trump make a lot more sense. Yes.
Okay, let's do Joseph Farrell again. Next question. Does DJ think that Liz Cheney's animus for Trump has to do at all with this COG operation?
That's an excellent question. And you're a mind reader, because that's exactly what I think is going on. Because who could be this obsessed? Think about it. Her whole career. All right. So she just threw her congressional seat away because of this. She joined in with Democrats to prosecute a fellow Republican. What was it Ronald Reagan said? You shall never do anything against a fellow Republican. So she's violating all those rules, and she's saying upon the exit of, her losing, I'm going to continue on, and I'm Abe Lincoln, because he lost, but he became president. And I will make sure that Trump never becomes president. And the next day she's on all these shows, and Savannah Guthrie is like, are you going to run for president? Wow. And she's like, I'm thinking about it. I'm going to take any steps to make sure Trump doesn't get in there. Doesn't make sense from any point of view, except for the fact that we have, as you mentioned, we've got Cheney in that mix. This is the thing. Cheney, who set up the continuity of government, who wants to see this thing executed on some level. And here is Trump, who went about through Schedule F, taking apart that apparatus, which, I start to wonder about Cheney going into that mountain bunker after 9/11 and coming out with the Patriot Act. What else did he do? And this, I think, starts to show up. And here we have on the surface just Liz Cheney, and the Democrats love Liz Cheney and all that stuff. But there's the whole thing about the media wants her to be president, but she just lost by 30 points in her home state, so she has no chance under ordinary circumstances. So this thing, basically, she's saying, I'll be the president of emergency powers. I'm available. And Dick Cheney, he set up his daughter for this probably many years ago. Yes.
Karen Carpenter, is the placement of Jackson Hole elite nesting place, Lawrence Rockefeller, Cheney's, etc., connected to UFO prevalence or some other covert purpose you are aware of?
You hit it. You hit it on the head. Well, hold it right there.
Okay.
This is so funny. Now, I was determined that, the original UFO file research is so interesting that the CIA sideshow is kind of a freak thing about it. But even this part of the whole UFO, thing, the grays, all those stories, everything is so interesting. But check this out, relating directly to your question and Wyoming and all the rest. Helena Blavatsky, who founded Theosophy, and this is in, I think it's Jerome Kern. It's his history of, it's his UFO history book. Wrote Helena Blavatsky, who we know is the founder of Theosophy, wrote of a hierarchy of ascended masters, including Venus-based Lords of the Flame. In the 1930s, the flamboyant guy Warren Ballard marketed a simplified, popular version of Blavatsky's doctrine. He spoke of his own meeting with 12 Venusian masters in the Teton Mountains of Wyoming. So maybe that answers it up. Maybe there's 12 Venusian masters hanging out up there, and that's why they're there. Religious studies scholar J. Gordon Melton identifies Ballard in 1939 with his I Am movement and is crucial to the development of the later contactee movement. Quote, not only did Ballard become the first to actually build a religion on contact with extraterrestrials, he writes, but his emphasis was placed upon frequent contact with the masters from whom he received regular messages to the followers of the world contactee movement. The movement took over the I Am spiritual hierarchy and changed it into a space command hierarchy. That's pretty interesting. But there it is, Wyoming, the Teton Mountains. Does that answer your question? I think it does.
Well, let me continue.
Okay.
Mind Control Incorporator says, DJ, does Liz Cheney have any grasp on the X-File? That might be a reason for her cockiness. And Post Atlanta says, does knowledge of the X-File mean access to time machines?
Yes. Well, remember it's interestingly enough, it's the UFO file and the X technology is in there, as is the UFO aspect. So the X technology, I've posited as something that goes all the way back to the Atlantean technology and may contain, Pythagoras, the Book of the Dead. I mean, it's got the whole lineage of that piece, including the John Keely's work and Tesla's work. That's the X technology. And then the UFO file, where they put all that, there's the whole question about, are we getting off-world visitors? And there's the crashed UFO, redeveloping, and all that stuff is in the UFO file. So I would say Liz Cheney knows all about it. As a matter of fact, Dick Cheney was questioned, and there were whistleblowers who came out of that whole Area 51 thing who said Cheney visited there often, which I would think is true. But he got questioned on a talk show, and he really got angry when they were talking to him about the UFO thing. And he said, if I did see it, it was classified and I wouldn't tell you, which is not a normal response. It definitely is the response of somebody who was working with the UFO file. If he's working with Bush as defense secretary and then with Bush's son as vice president, he certainly knows a whole gaggle about the UFO file. So that means that she does. For sure. Yes.
Do we know whether Dick Cheney went to Antarctica?
If you email me about that, I have something about Cheney's piece, but I don't have him off the top of my head in Antarctica. It's possible. But there's a whole program in the 70s that involved John Warner's dad, Senator Warner from Virginia. And I wouldn't be surprised if there isn't in that deep freeze program some involvement of Rumsfeld and Cheney. But I'll have to get back to you on that one. Go for it.
Shazam. Were these, quote, young, unassuming kids, unquote, gathering intel and really cleaning house at the highest level?
They were. And if you can find stories about them and their operations and how they worked very tightly as a group, and they would target out different people by going into their backgrounds, and they were working very quickly. And when they would get rid of somebody, they had the ability through this Moultrie person because he became in charge of all personnel, they could instantly replace them with people who were more in tune with Trump's defense vision. And as I said, they did it in over 70 cases that I know of. It may have been a lot more. But there's this process of Trump going through the Defense Department and intelligence services at the end of his administration and working in ways to reshape it. And it doesn't make any sense on the surface of it. He also activates JFK's national security memorandum that's been sitting there since 1962. That's interesting. If we look at it, what was he doing operating with this group? We'll have to ask Troop Hemingway. Go ahead.
Okay, Simone Nyman. Is COG connected to the WEF and Davos? And MB ultimately is in the Committee of 300 all over this. Robert Scott says the British group's Committee of 300 helped set up the OSS and later the CIA.
Oh, yeah. I mean, if you look at the influence that the World Economic Forum has on the Biden administration, it's off the charts. So, therefore, are they in charge of COG? There's an interlocking piece that goes on here. Remember, one of the interesting things that Professor Scott mentioned about COG was not to think of it to think of it more like a system that can be used by one side or another. So, if good people are in charge and they utilize it, they can use it for good purposes. But the ability to piggyback on its clandestine role with no oversight, the ability for a 9/11 to take place, for example, and for the government to use the continuity of government, um, you know, to exercise those powers to trade weapons with other countries by using the Doomsday Network. The Doomsday Network is set up completely outside of government control, so the NSA can't eavesdrop on it, which means no one will ever know what you discussed on that Doomsday Network because it's meant to be used in the event of a nuclear incident. And then later, they threw in that language, oh, any emergency. But the idea is that thing is foolproof and no one can get access to it. So it has to be that secret. So if I utilize it, for example, as Ollie North did, uh, and as these different people through history did, as we see, John Dean helped set it up, as we pointed out, then you can see the ability for abuse of that system. And the continuity of government program has grown without oversight so dramatically that you have literally an underground government that is unaccountable. And that government we know so very little about. Professor Scott spent 5 decades studying COG, and he says we know it's the least known of all the different things that we have in the government. So obviously, you would expect some of that because of the nature of its role as emergency management. But the idea of the potential for abuse of saying and citing emergency powers and then saying this is martial law. Remember, we had governors who were like, I could call martial law if I want to because it's an emergency. That was Gavin Newsom letting go the mentality. Justin Trudeau, I'm calling an emergency because these truckers are calling me out and I'm saying that they're racist. That's not a policy position. Actually, what's interesting is, you saying that they don't have any rights because you can call them names is absurd, right? And so what they did instead was they targeted them financially and all the rest. But that emergency thing that they pressed the button on, that was to show, look, World Economic Forum, I'm your man. Look at me and Chrystia Freeland, who I've given 2 different job titles to, just like Scott Morrison and the Australian PM saying, well, now I am the PM, I'm the defense secretary, I'm the health secretary, and, all these positions are me, and I'm not telling anybody about it. So what I think that we need and what would really open this stuff up on the secrecy side, one is real oversight of the continuity of government program with really accountable people like a Rand Paul or someone along this line. That's one. And then two, a real sweep through the government to make sure that there are no secret proclamations going on for people anointing themselves as defense secretary or whatever it happens to be, the way Morrison was. I think the Biden administration is really worth investigating for those types of things. And I think that they're coming directly from being captured by groups like the World Economic Forum and the influence of the CCP as well. I don't go over the edge of the cliff and say the CCP has done all this stuff because they don't have the ability to do all the stuff that we're seeing. But they are involved in influencing the DNC. There's no question about that. Yes.
Simone Nyman, so much Nazi influence in Western leadership, it's definitely the Fourth Reich.
Oh, wow. Well, I agree with you. Fourth Reich was the original term that Mae Brussel gave to this, and she had studied that Nazi overhang into the U.S. government. I mean, remember, the Nazi overhang goes into the Russian government as well. But we seem to have picked up really some prime scientists and some real ideology overhang from that as well. But Jim Marrs used it for his famous book. If I really want to track the Nazi influence post-war, it's Joseph Farrell's work. I mean, it's laid out there, and it opens you up to the exotic technology. And then we get into the UFO file. You can't miss it. You're right in the heart of it. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. We're going deep, deep tonight on the continuity of government program and its concomitant relationship there with the UFO file. We're going to be taking a few more of your questions here. It's great to have so many of you here with us. Yes.
Is there a particular episode with Joseph that you can recommend that covers the Fourth Reich?
All of them.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, you know, they have different aspects, but certainly there's a playlist, and I need to add to it, but there's a playlist on this YouTube channel of interviews with Dr. Farrell. And if you're a member, also all the audio files are available there as well. But there's a number. If you type in, you know, Farrell Third Way, that'll give you Joseph Farrell, Dark Journalist Third Way. That'll give you a lot on that front in particular. Yes.
Joseph wants to talk to you about Riconosciuto, Inslaw, and Promise.
Yes. So wow.
That looks like that'll be the next episode.
You know, I have to say, that one, I'd be very excited to do that one with you. I can just picture all the wonderful things that are going to come out about that. And also, you know, what's interesting is Riconosciuto got out of prison fairly recently, and he's been pretty incognito. For sure. Yes.
Okay.
You know who else got out of prison?
Who?
Reagan's assassin, or Reagan's potential assassin, John Hinckley Jr. And, you know, he's a musician after all this time. He doesn't remember anything about all that stuff. And he set up a big show there. They were going to let him do this show, and then the promoter in New York City canceled it at the last minute for some reason, and he had to go back into interesting obscurity. John Hinckley Jr. and the Jodie Foster cover as, you know, the attempt to remove Reagan in 1981 as part of a whole program of assassination that was happening, including the attempt on the Pope, the assassination of Anwar Sadat, the killing of John Lennon. It was just a season of assassination. And someone was working overdrive to take over. And we know that Bush and his family had that direct relationship with Hinckley's family. It's pretty strange. I mean, you don't find that, you know, this was remarkable in a sense. And so Hinckley, I think, and the idea that Hinckley is free is pretty unusual. Yes.
Okay. I've got a bunch of questions for you, all the same topic. Okay. Tony David, question. Do you think it's possible the feds are terrified DJT has information on them in his possession and their crimes, especially the Russian hoax? Holy Smoke says FBI trying to recover pedophile records at Mar-a-Lago, just like Little Black Book and Watergate. Northern Light says, could Trump have the 9/11 file with him too? And Jay Vanderbest said, did Trump have Tesla's documents at Mar-a-Lago?
I mean, we'd have to guess. We know the nature of it is something that they can't live without. And there's also a MacGuffin aspect of this too, which is he's got something big and we want it. So that justifies anything that we do, the raids and all the rest. I think that he could have something that I think that they think that they need a way into his knowledge base, and that his knowledge of the UFO file, one, of the Tesla technology, and the fact that his uncle studied it, and the fact that his uncle was the protege of Vannevar Bush, who ran the UFO file, is undeniable. But then on that other swing is the thing that Joseph Farrell has pointed out, which is Roy Cohn, really, he has the blueprint for the deep state. He knows where the key goes in the hole and opens the whole thing up. So the Clintons, the Bushes, this kind of thing, they're in a kind of group unison hatred of this character, because the two biggest secrets of the U.S. government are available to him. And he probably utilized them to get into the presidency and to have that incredible, base of power when he got in. So they've been looking, they've been looking so crazily, I think, at Trump. Now, that doesn't mean that Trump would do the greatest things with all that, and he's going to set the world right with free energy technology. No, but it does mean that he knows. So he knows there are those who know and those who suspect, right? So he knows, and so he's a really big problem. So this is their overreach into it. Now, they may have thought, we'll do the raid. He'll be surprised. He won't know. And we'll find this thing that we're looking for. The thing that they're looking for could be related directly to the UFO file. I think that for the way that they handled it and the frenzy of the whole thing, it seems to me that's what it is. The idea that Trump and his legal team wouldn't be smart enough to know that a nuclear secret hanging around, they've tried to put these stories out there. They did it with the Washington Post, which really makes the whole thing suspect. The minute they said nuclear, and they were like, yeah, it was found like ripped up in his bathroom. So, it's ridiculous. So they're willing to use this real dum-dum explanation MacGuffin. I think the UFO file explains a lot in this regard. And so that would be my bet. Yeah.
Okay, Jim and Mammy. I bought a Trump coloring book at the dollar store for $3 during the first election. It was weird. It had weird and funny drawings. One is of Trump shaking an alien's hand in Area 50. What did they know?
Thank you for sharing. I always think those, those go back to the National Enquirer thing where they had like Clinton shaking hands with aliens and stuff. I mean, it's always pretty interesting. And the fact is, on some level, subconsciously, we know that these people know a whole lot more around these topics than we do. And this is part of the problem. I go back to that question since we brought up Kennedy tonight, the Judge Napolitano conversation, and I've run this through a number of times, and I'm going to get Judge Napolitano on the show to talk about the whole situation with Trump. But one of the things that he pointed out was that he expected that Trump was going to release these JFK records because Trump was really into doing that. And when it came around and Trump didn't do it, well, he released some, but he left the CIA records. Napolitano flipped out on him and said, what's going on? Why don't you release those? And Trump was adamant. I can't. If you saw what I saw that's in there, you couldn't release it either. So we have to think about what that is. And to me, that's also directly related to the UFO file because nothing else really explains it in my mind. Something in there. There's some mechanism that probably Bobby Kennedy, who met immediately with the CIA director after the assassination, put a booby trap in there so that if the file ever got out, there would be some understanding about what went on there. And he could always use that as some kind of leverage against the CIA, because otherwise you'd think, oh, they just get rid of the file and big deal, right? The government's like that. But there's some mechanism in the file that they can't get rid of it somehow. That's remarkable. And I'll tell you, until I heard that, I had always wondered about the amount of stretching out when we're going to release those records, because, next year it's 60 years since the JFK assassination. What could you not, you can't rationalize that in any normal fashion. So what is it? There is something in those records that they don't want to hit. And instead of just being able to scrap that record, there must be a corresponding record somewhere that if they put this out and that corresponding record maybe in the Kennedy Library or something says, no, that if they do this, it means they're acting illegally. There's some booby trap now. I'm convinced of that. And that's why there's something in there, and that's why they won't let it out. The Central Intelligence Agency did so many different things to so many different people around the Kennedy assassination to destroy careers. We saw the death lists every time there was an investigation, the Warren Commission, the House Assassinations Committee, ARRB had its own series of deaths associated with it. So, they have a lot to hide. And ultimately, in terms of the question of the credibility of the intelligence services in this country, the problem is that it's kind of fundamentally understood that the CIA participated in the JFK assassination. So it's something that is almost inescapable for them. And so I think of that as, that stealth archive out there that we know it's out there, but they know that they haven't shown it, but we know that they did it, basically. Yes.
Food provider, does DJ think whatever the FBI was after, if found, could be announced, or would it be suppressed?
Well, look, this is interesting. I was going to go into this legal part a little bit deeper. I didn't get to it tonight, but we know that there are moves now, and that same judge who previously had worked for the Epstein team, which is pretty weird, let's face it, and before he had signed off on the warrant for Trump, had recused himself from the Clinton-Trump lawsuit that's going on. So the fact that he didn't recuse himself the second time is kind of odd. I think there needs to be some answers for that. But he went into court on Thursday and said, I actually want a redacted version of the affidavit released, which is a big surprise. So somebody in there thinks it's a good idea to show that. Right now, Merrick Garland, his credibility, the administration, the whole thing looks like a Democratic pile-on, and it does help Trump, which is weird too. But whatever they thought they were doing, I don't know if they got the thing that they were looking for, but maybe they think they got enough to give him a hard time with. But there are some things going on here, which is the media is saying, aha, Trump is going to, he won't be able to run because he's going to be indicted and all the rest. It's not true. He can be in the middle of a murder trial and he can still run for president. He could be in jail and run for president. So the only thing that we need constitutionally is for him to be living in this country for 14 years, to be 35 years or older, and to be born in America. That's it. There's nothing else in the Constitution that says anything else. So whenever they say you're barred, because the liberal establishment doesn't like you and they've gone after you legally, you can't run for president. There's no law anywhere. Go ask any real lawyer or judge. I've checked it out thoroughly. Trust me, there's nothing that can stop you from being president, except if you're not 35, if you haven't lived here 14 years, or if you weren't born here. That's it. So you can be in solitary confinement. You can be Julian Assange, well, he wasn't born here, but you could be a political prisoner and run for president and win. So this thing, in the media, they just think if they say something and that you won't check it out, that the average person won't check it out. So they have this kind of idiocy factor going on. And I've over and over again, whenever they say these things, whenever I've checked them out, they all fall apart. And this one in particular is kind of insidious because I think they're trying to whip up their supporters by being, yeah, let's get this case and make sure Trump can't run. Well, he can run, even if you get him on some weird technicality and he's in a legal mess and the case is ongoing or whatever. Doesn't matter. He'll run and he could win if he's viable, And that's not even saying, it'd be the greatest thing in the world if Trump won, right? Trump would be far superior to the Biden administration, there's no question about it. Biden administration has open borders. They are completely unconstitutional. It's just and it's run by someone who's basically insane and has dementia. So, anything's an improvement. Yes. The Trump administration, there are a number of things that people thought he was going to do, and
he should have done.
Yeah, he did some things that, like, he locked the border, which I think was a powerful move. We just saw these incredible pictures of this guy who has a huge ranch right along the border in Texas, and he has a fence there, and he locked the fence, and there were a number of illegal aliens trying to stream into the country illegally through his fence, but he had locked it. And then they show the Border Patrol agents saying, open that fence up. We have to open it up and let these people in and we'll process them. Well, that's the government acting illegally. What are you going to do at that point? So they're sick. They want to overrun the country with people, and they're hoping to be able to make America chaotic by doing this and turn it into a melting pot civil war situation. That's not a normal immigration thing. We have a very good balanced immigration program in America. Illegal immigration on this level of people just breaking into the country, and supposedly all these, they have all these rules and they're like, hey, we have all these COVID things you need to pay attention to. And then instead they're like, no, let these 3 million people come into the country. So they don't care anything about science or anything else that they have to say. I don't know. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense. All right.
It makes my blood boil. Okay. Matakwe Oyasin. Does DJ think Pence was compromised in some way at the end?
I think Pence is kind of a straight man. And I think he was a traditional Republican. And I think he was something that Trump needed to hold on to. I don't think Trump really let him in on a lot. And I think he caved when the pressure came in. A lot of people are like, Pence stabbed Trump in the back and stuff. It's possible, but I just see him as, a not so great politician. And I don't see any possibility of him getting anywhere in terms of running for president because he doesn't have any charisma or good programs or anything like that. So I think he's going nowhere. We know that Governor DeSantis has a very good shot if we aren't dealing with a Trump presidency. I feel under normal circumstances, if Trump ran and DeSantis ran, it would still be Trump's game, and that DeSantis would probably be, because Trump won't, this is it for Trump. He'll be 78 when he would run in 2024. So there's a lot of things that you can see going on there. And you might say, well, Trump has certain baggage, but he's also been president, which gives him a dramatic advantage going in. So we just don't know. And on that level, a lot of people talk about an ideal candidate. And DeSantis has shown a lot of, throwing off. He's made Florida an incredibly free state. He's thrown off a lot of the fascist mandates and things of that nature. So he gets, he's going places for sure. But, they'll find out things about him. They'll be like, oh, he's connected to the mafia. And, so there's always going to be all of these people. None of them are perfect. So you're always going to find something. And so there's a little bit of a purist snobbery around candidates in a way. But what I would say is, who's observing on that level, who has a real chance to be president and is observing the Constitution? Now, you might say a lot of Republicans, I've pointed this out about Republicans, which is they tend to follow the Constitution because that's where their voter base is. And their voter base knows the Constitution. For some reason, the DNC was taken over by neocons who convinced them that the Constitution didn't matter and that going to war was the whole idea. Go over and have war with Ukraine and Russia and, all these types of things. So unfortunately, the democratic ideal in the Democratic Party is gone. There's a lot of compromised Republicans, but the general audience, the target audience, that demographic that supports Republicans, they're fundamentally Constitution embracing people. And the Constitution is the answer to all these questions because all of these people, whether they're congressmen, judges, presidents, they all swear an oath to the Constitution. The Constitution is still active. That's the thing they haven't been able to get rid of. Yes.
Violet Lotus, why do all presidents renew the NDAA? Who is telling them to?
Well, that's a lot of power. Look, $800 billion that's just what we know about, right? So it represents over $1 trillion, in my opinion. And so you need that every year. That's the slush fund. Remember this also. There's no Democrats and no Republicans who dissent from the NDAA. Once in a while, there's someone who votes absent. But that's all you're going to get. There's no dissent on NDAA. They all do it because they all get the money. They're like, oh, you didn't hold up that money thing? Good. You get your little prize for your district or whatever. So that's a power and a money game, and it really goes deep. Here's the other thing. Haven't you noticed that we're not really at war anywhere? And we're helping Ukraine and giving them all this money for a war they can't win, not inspiring negotiations with Russia. And it's really like a terrible, where's the diplomatic effort for peace? It doesn't exist because they want this. They like this. They like this neocon structure that's in charge of the Biden administration. This is what they're good at. So But, where's all that, the $1 trillion going for the military every year? Where does it go? If there's no war, they create this illusion of war and just pile the money in. So it's pretty interesting. But the NDAA, as I'm saying, it's being used as a plaything for all types of forces now, because what it says is, if I am on the Senate Intelligence Committee and I say, I won't let you pass this bill without attaching this weird UFO threat thing to it, that's a Central Intelligence move. And they're like, all right, okay, you can have your little weird UFO threat thing. You attach it through the NDAA, and we don't want to stop the bill because everybody won't get their money. So that's what they're doing with it. And I see groups, all the time using that threat who are involved in it. I'm going to attach it to the NDAA. And then the president's always signed it. It always renews the emergency powers. It's a real problem. It's like the entire budget process is controlled by the NDAA every year, and they keep logging more and more kind of suspicious pork on it every year. Okay. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're going deep tonight. We're going to take a couple more questions. And I want to say this before I forget, which is, and this is something that Bruce Ross sent over to me. And Bruce was in our documentary, the UFO File, Ex Protect, and his whole story about his mom, Yvonne DiCarlo. But he sent this thing over to me from Children's Health Defense, which is RFK Jr. put this up, I guess, today. And he said, we've been deplatformed on our Facebook page. It was suspended. Our Instagram account disabled. This is how they work. More than 500,000 followers have been denied the truth. So they took the Children's Health Defense Facebook and Instagram pages down, and imagine all that incredible effort and work that they've put into it. And he says, learn about this ruthless censorship and how to follow us. Share this everywhere. And he's on Twitter still. That's Children's HD, Children's Health Defense. That's RFK Jr.'s. He has a new edition of that book coming out, and we are going to have him back on the program. But more appalling censorship. Think about the mission of Children's Health Defense and the things he's trying to do.
That is the most fantastic website.
It is.
I can't. Yes. I wish I had more time to dig deep, because it is an incredible resource.
I agree.
Okay.
My goodness.
Elizabeth Huss, did not Trump audit the FBI on the first weekend he was in office?
I think there were, there were some questions around Comey. He got rid of Comey, and that instantly set up the dynamic. Before he got in, the FBI was on him, and so was the CIA, and the whole phony, he's a Russian. So, they targeted him. Look, this is the nature of the problem, is the partisanship. When they see it, they're like, good, you got the guy that I don't like, or whatever. And this is the same thing with the raid. You hear a lot of this on the Democratic side. It doesn't matter who the person is, whether it's Trump or, I can't even name a good Democrat anymore. But whoever it happens to be, this is America. You can't just raid your opponent, that's so there's a problem there. And the idea of the FBI or the CIA determining who gets to be in office is sick. That's deep state takeover. And there were a lot of people who took their dislike of Trump and were like, and these were good researchers before. And they'd be like, yeah, let's empower the deep state to kick some ass against Trump. I mean, I couldn't believe it. I'd followed those people for years, and they knew about government things. They followed the JFK assassination. They'd put out great books about it. So they knew all about the CIA and all the rest, but their obsession around not letting Trump in was like, no, but if the deep state has to take over to stop Trump, okay. Well, you're crazy at that point. You're not working inside a constitutional structure. You've gone nuts. And it doesn't matter who we're talking about. And there's a lot of defenses like that. Well, as long as it doesn't have the guy that I don't want in there, it's worth it. No, it's not. Either you operate, this is what I always say in the kind of work that I do. If you're in the truth-telling business and you don't tell the truth, then you get out of the business. And the same thing is true in the whole political circle. It's a democratic republic. So if you're a democratic republic, you operate under democratic republic rules of law. And it's that simple. And if you don't, then you're not. So, you have to go back and check in with yourself and maybe do an ethics course, to regain that and regain your composure and balance that was taken away by the entrainment of the media or whatever it happens to be. So, we can all have all kinds of different political opinions, but we can't let the CIA decide who gets to be president. That's sick.
Actually, everybody needs to go and watch Mr. Smith Goes to Washington Again.
Yes.
Because his speech about how this style of government that we have is such an achievement,
That's
when
true.
you think that it's just breathtaking. It always brings me to tears.
There's no question.
It's so precious. It's so valuable, and we cannot let it fail at this point. It's our job to make sure that we sustain it.
We've seen examples of what happens when governments fall into psychosis and totalitarian behavior. They're trying that in America. And, our awareness level stops them. That's all there is to it. And, the intense militarization that's going on, the militarization of space, which space is supposed to be for exploration, and it's a scientific endeavor. The idea of locking humanity forever into these wars in space, on Earth, and all the rest is serving the interests of a very small group. And I think one of the first things we could do is develop a resolute peace to demilitarize space. All nations must agree to do that. That should be a mission of our planet. Not Amazon deciding what your social score is. I mean, it's ridiculous. So we have a lot of work to do. Yes.
Okay, so Debbie Peterson, would they even tell us if COG was implemented? And Najat Madri, if they hit the COG button, would there be a big food fight? Who would be in charge? It would be a big mob war.
That's why the whole martial law aspect of COG is so crucial, because they move into position quick. I mean, what happened during the COVID op? There are aspects of it there. We saw it. They shut down businesses. If you do anything, a bunch of police show up and shut you down. So churches, you can't go to church. If you show up at church, a bunch of jackbooted thugs are going to come after you, right? So these were all unconstitutional actions and activities. We've witnessed them. So we can easily see how the continuity of government program could roll in like that. All they need is the right emergency. And I think they study and they look, what's the proper emergency for this? Well, the cybersecurity thing, something I think they're building up. The UFO threat, though, is something that has been designed for a long time. I think that their great question around the UFO thing is, could they pull it off? Because it's a pretty drastic action. However, we've seen indications that they want people now to believe in aliens, an enemy UFO threat. And that's all CIA. And we saw it through Tom DeLonge and the TTSA. It was set up all by CIA people. I mean, by their own account. It's not Dark Journalist saying that. It's their bio. Jim Semivan, 25 years at the very top of the CIA directorate. What was he? He was their VP. It's just CIA operation for the UFO file, which reminds me that the Space Force Intelligence Group put out their own logo, and I thought this was particularly interesting. Someone sent this to me, and I really take a look at the pharaoh over the globe. You explain that one to me.
This is incredible.
I mean, I like
GG.
Egyptian imagery, but hey, take a good look, right? Go ahead.
It's amazing. No, I just wanted to make sure Gigi was paying attention.
I see. Yeah. It's sort of right up Gigi's alley. We got to know what they're doing there, and we're going to have Gigi Young back on the show here very shortly. So get excited for that. We have something special up our sleeve for that. I had something else for you. Going back to the original UFO thing real quickly, Donald Kehoe is a key figure from the Air Force who called this out. Close friend of Lindbergh, and he and Lindbergh used to fly around together, see UFOs all the time. before it became a big thing. Kehoe in the 50s is all the real disclosure. He goes on the TV programs, they all deny it. It's exactly like what you hear, all the stuff going on about UFOs now. He's calling out the whole thing. That's in 1956, right? But the group that I call X-Protect, that's inside the aerospace intelligence wing, that corridor, the defense contractors, and is a very obscure group. He calls the silence group. And I think that there's a real correlation there. And so the elimination of different types of early researchers, that with Morris Jessup, that story, and, how they've tried to whitewash that one on a number of occasions, but it's a very important story. And I think his getting too close in between that and the Philadelphia experiment really did that. But the fact that Kehoe had the silence group pegged is very interesting. Here's something that I think is interesting also. In the early UFO era, such reports, relatively rare but hardly non-existent, received little attention. This is the actual contact part. In 1950, when the first book with flying saucers in the title, it was Donald Kehoe's paperback, Flying Saucers Are Real. That's a very interesting book. It saw print. The occupants of the vehicles, Kehoe believed them to be peaceable extraterrestrials who deliberately refrained from contact. Could only be speculated about. But check this out. Another book published that same year, Frank Scully's Behind the Flying Saucers, and I really think that Scully was onto something, asserted that the U.S. government had recovered crashed spacecraft containing the bodies of little men dressed in the style of the 1890s. This was how they saw it. They couldn't quite figure out what was going on there, but they saw it as them dressed up as the 1890s. I thought that coming directly from that era, unfiltered, was kind of fascinating. Yes.
MP, why does DJ say there is no threat? After all, he interviewed Dr. David Jacobs.
Look, Jacobs is fascinating, and he has a great deal of research around the whole hybrid aspect. What I'm really referring to is the bang bang CIA, the UFO threat is out there and we'll save you thing. It doesn't mean that any off-world visitor or any interdimensional thing would be all positive. I think that's, unreasonable. But the threat thing has been built up for a long time. Fletcher Prouty, this is interesting because Fletcher Prouty knew, as the intermediary between the Joint Chiefs and the CIA, all about the JFK assassination and how the government worked, etc. In 1997, in a republishing of his book, The Secret Team, in the intro, he says, it looks to me like they always need a war. They always need an enemy. And it looks to me like UFOs and aliens are being dressed up for the part. That's 1997 from an inside intel guy. So you tell me, it's 25 years later. Have they built the UFO threat? You bet. You bet they have. Yes.
This is an interesting question. The Arts Collective, if we ever have legit disclosure, re the UFO file, do you think it will amount to doodly squat?
I don't believe in the government disclosing the truth about UFOs. I think that they'll disclose things like they are now to service a program that they want to build, but I don't think it'll be related to a PSYOP. And we have a lot of PSYOPers out there. It's interesting because I pointed out Elizondo and Chris Mellon and the things that they've been engaged in since the TTSA and the amount of just lies that they've told in public. Now we have a thing with Elizondo, and it's a new segment. It's called Loose-Suze. So the latest thing is, John Greenwald from the Black Vault did a whole breakdown on this complaint that Elizondo did for the IG, and he shows all the holes. And again, we have this incredible inconsistency because these counterintelligence people, they come out with a mission, and the mission is counterintelligence. So, here we have Elizondo talking about how he ran this, UFO ATIP. And then later we find out in his own words, that ATIP wasn't a program, it was an activity. Well, playing darts or playing baseball is an activity, right? So that's not anything like what they started with when they came out, as him as a disgruntled whistleblower from this UFO secret program in the New York Times and all that. So then we find out that the actual program was called OSAP. That's what got the money from Harry Reid and Bigelow and all that. ATIP, there's no such thing as ATIP. It doesn't exist except as a nickname. That's it. That's the only evidence that's on the table for that. It's been proven over and over again. So unless they have some proof of this thing, which he said, he also has said, I had nothing to do with OSAP. So that's weird too. So then you wonder, well, what exactly was your role? There's this piece that's in the book that George Knapp did on Skinwalker with Colm Kelleher. And they don't really mention anything about Elizondo in there, although Knapp has been really the biggest promoter of Elizondo, and people like Dolan have plugged him and all that stuff. And supposedly Dolan's doing a national, like the third version of his national history of UFOs or something. He's going to include all the TTSA junk. Don't even bother. Don't waste our time. I mean, it was all junk. TTSA is $50 million in debt. That's a lot of
50 million.
50.
Wow.
That's a lot of spilling money to try to make a threat narrative happen. And but anyway, so this guy now who says that the program that he ran actually, wasn't a program, it was an activity. That's different, right? That's kind of interesting. Well, an activity that was unfunded by the government. So it's just you sort of doing your thing. So in the George Knapp book, it basically shows Elizondo comes in and talks to these people and says, I had all these remote viewing experiences. That doesn't sound like he was running a UFO program. So I don't know, the nature of that operation that the TTSA ran and the CIA push with these people. I've laid it out very dramatically, but interestingly enough, Greenwald has really tried to be open and fair. And, he's gone over all the inconsistencies and try to show, well, I'm giving you all the rope. Just tell us, what the real story is. And so at a certain point, he just got sick of it. And he was like, I'm going to examine this complaint and show all the holes that are involved with it. And he did a really good job for 3 hours. But as soon as it was done, Elizondo put out a thing that said, I was the director of ATIP. It's been well documented. I've been the subject of a campaign of defamatory disinformation by multiple parties. And then he has his lawyer underneath basically say, don't defame Elizondo, because if you do, then it's legally actionable. No, it's not. He's a public figure, and if he has said mistruths in public, or if he said things that are inconsistent, anyone who's a journalist has the ability to do it. So I want to point this out to anybody who's on that tip. And by the way, we've dealt with weird court stuff before through the Corey Goode trying to, sue people who were calling out his bogus UFO cult. Look, there's nothing in the independent media that is intimidated by, the Central Intelligence Agency or their lawyers calling people out and saying, you can't criticize the people that we have out there, So they come to us under a great misunderstanding, because there is nothing, and I mean nothing, that is going to stop me from investigating the CIA meddling in the UFO file story. Okay, is that clear enough for you? I hope that it is. So this idea that they can scare people by saying, I'm going to sue you, look, bring it on. We'll make a reality show out of it, okay? It'll be called Loose Sues. And, I think that we have to be real about this, though, because their ability to throw around things like that to try to stop the truth from coming out, especially with how severe and important this story is now in getting the truth out, and the incredible meddling of the Central Intelligence Agency in our media, in our lives, in our legal system for years, for 75 years. The anniversary of the National Security Act is coming up in September. 75 years of this junk. So no, if anything, we need to redouble our efforts to expose the CIA, and I'll tell you something about the Central Intelligence Agencies, they really should be in hot water, because what's coming out about them is that they spent all this time in 2020, before they grabbed Julian Assange, planning to assassinate him there at the London embassy. Isn't that nice? How do you like that for a government agency that you pay for, planning on their own to go assassinate somebody who has called out the government?
And that was Pompeo, right?
Yeah, Mike
Under
Pompeo.
Trump.
Oh, there's no question. Yeah, it happened during the Trump administration, and Trump had the ability to save Assange, and he didn't. But there was a lot of simpatico with Trump and Assange, interestingly enough, because Assange releasing the regular Hillary emails and showing the corruption of the DNC in depriving Bernie Sanders of the nomination was key, in my opinion, to Trump winning in 2016. So I think these things need to be looked at a different level. But the Central Intelligence Agency, if they felt they had received unlawful directions from Mike Pompeo, they could go back to him and say, we can't just assassinate some citizen. But instead, they laid out a plan and attempted to assassinate Assange. So we live in that world. Look, the world's been shaped by their assassination policies since 1963 and before, but certainly that level of deep state interaction. So, calling out that Central Intelligence Agency as it invades different aspects of our democracy is crucial. And that is a function of journalism. Here's another thing, that investigative journalism is adversarial journalism, and that's protected too. I mean, if you were trying to track down a chemical CEO who was like dumping acid in a river or something, that's not going to be a very friendly back and forth relationship, so it's not personal. And I think that's crucial. But you have to understand that investigative journalism isn't something where, we ignore the fact that you lie in public. No, you're going to get found out for the things that you've put on the record that are inconsistent, and you're going to have the ability to clear them up. And I've always said in relation to this show that any one of these characters, when it comes to having a gentleman's debate, I'm wide open. So that's my take on that. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. Unbelievable. And of course, always try to intimidate when you're getting to the truth. It's been great. We're going to take a couple more questions, and then we're going to sign out. I have so many good things tonight. I can't stop going back to the pile here. Hang on one second.
Can I throw something out while you're looking for that? Okay, Bobo the Clown says Tucker Carlson is doing a special reporting on UFOs.
Cattle mutilation.
Yes. How come Tucker Carlson isn't interviewing Linda Moulton Howe? What do you think?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's not so much the question. The question really is, the problem is the people that Tucker, this is happening, Megyn Kelly, and all these people are getting into UFOs. They don't know anything about the UFO field. So they're interviewing a lot of the Bobos, like Chris Mellon and people like that, who have an agenda. And when you look into that, you have to go back to people like Fox and say, look, those are intel people. That's an agenda of pushing a UFO threat. Let's get into the real UFO file thing. So that's the demand, I think, that the audience can place on somebody like a Megyn Kelly or a Tucker, or even Joe Rogan, who has this whole thing promoting Lazar. And, don't get me wrong, there's always been interesting things about the Lazar story and all the rest. But largely, he's been shown to be someone who lied about his education and all these other things. So you can't take that face value and not follow up properly, And then they have people that I really consider kind of carnival barker level marketers, and I say that having given them a chance. But the Corbell and all that kind of stuff, it's all, oh, there are beach balls attacking Navy ships. And so, I mean, that's not the real UFO file. Those people are engaged and involved with building a UFO threat. That's why, those UAP threat task force and things like that feed them these dummy stories so the media can follow up on it and they can jam things like these UFO File defense offices, which is what they want. They want a corridor to move this money through. So let's get real about it. Okay, we have a real UFO File and real genuine research, which goes through generations of researchers. Look at Kehoe's back to the 50s, right? I met and knew Stanton Friedman. We did many shows together. Jim Mars, all these people studied the UFO File. They worked on it for years before this 2017 hoax of TTSA and, this whole thing that came out with Leslie Kean. And the whole Leslie Kean story is pretty strange too, the way that she participated in this. And then all of a sudden it was like, here's the Netflix special and stuff. I don't know. To me, the whole thing looks like a system that is meant to reward the promotion of the UFO threat narrative. It's extremely dangerous and we can cut through it. But when you have naive people who mean well, even getting into Tucker and all that stuff, he doesn't know anything about the UFO File. You can tell by bringing on, the kind of intel people, unless he wants the intel version, the CIA version of UFO disclosure, then have at it. The CIA is used to lying to the public. That's what you'll get. So, and Megyn Kelly is particularly funny because, she does these shows and she comes on like gangbusters about UFOs. And she just doesn't know anything about the topic. Like, study it and study the fact that the government has fed misinformation into the UFO field for decades. You have to start there and try to get some genuine people on there. But yeah, I was surprised to see Fox, and they were kind of schlocking it up. They were like mysteries, and they showed a guy in a robe, with like no face. It was like, Dr. Death or something. I mean, come on, this is not Mystery Science Theater. Let's do something a little bit better. Okay, yeah.
Okay. Soft Alloy 08. So if
Dr. Doom.
if COG is in full effect, doesn't that mean the Constitution has been made suspended?
Well, there's already problems with the Constitution being suspended as a result of the September 11th attacks and the Emergency Act that gets renewed as part of the NDAA. So there's already a challenge there. Technically, the Constitution is not supposed to be suspended. So the question is, until continuity of government is enacted and the Northcom commander takes over, that supposedly suspends the Constitution. But guess what? That's not legal either. So there's no condition under which you can suspend the Constitution. It doesn't exist. It doesn't say in the Constitution, by the way, you can suspend this in an emergency. No, it doesn't exist. Emergency powers is dreamed up by, the likes of Adolf Hitler and the Enabling Act that gave the Reichstag fires the excuse to combine the offices of the chancellor and the presidency to become supreme dictator. That's how they did it. It's always emergency. You have to observe the emergency powers and how they're used. They become especially risky in times when leaders can't get support and they need something to keep themselves afloat. And if they don't get it, they're out. And being out might literally mean being out of this world. So they'll do anything to keep the emergency going. And, that's what we're looking at. And we could be looking at the whole cybersecurity thing. Anytime the government gets involved on this, there's tons of money to be made. There's tons of control to be had. There's tons of reining in the cattle. This is the way that they think. I think we can get to a different place with this by exposing it. And we've seen that the public has a tremendous loss of respect and belief in the politicians, the political scene, and also in the media. That's really good. That's some of the best news. So the question is, what can we do to give them the right piece? And especially in obscure areas like UFOs. And let me tell you, you do not want to involve, the first rule with UFO research is kick the CIA out. You don't want anything to do with CIA agents, CIA people saying I'm a whistleblower, that whole trip of the TTSA and all those intel people, counterintelligence people from TTSA through the CIA. And, guys like Semi Van saying, hey, I'm not only trying to get UFO disclosure. I'm a contactee and a CIA agent. Isn't that nice? I mean, these people really, they'll take it as far as they can. But I think an aware and alert research field wards off that stuff because they don't have the opening to do it. But if something like the UFO field goes along with that, if they fold and if they're like, oh, what a relief, the CIA is pumping money into this field, then that's bad news because the field is going to just get whirled up in some kind of CIA psyop. So we don't want that to happen. We want to rein it in. We want it to be a good field of research for humanity to understand this very strange phenomena. It doesn't need any of that. We don't need the intelligence interference. Let's put it that way. Miss Olivia, we'll take 2 more questions and we're done.
Okay, I just wanted to throw this out. Melissa Claguerta. I don't know what is more evil than not caring about liberty for a paycheck. I would say maybe actively working against liberty for a paycheck, but...
Oh, there's no doubt about it. It's disappointing, but you see it a lot. Fitz used to have a great... She used to say this to me just generally in conversation, and then later I heard her talking about it in public, which is that not only do people sell out, but she's always shocked at how little people sell out for. And I think that that's a really kind of great realization based on life experience, and I've seen that myself a great deal. I think it's very simple that, people who have that sort of mindset, go to Wall Street, start a strip club, like go into that world where those types of things are accepted. And, if you're in like the research world or if you're in politics and things of this nature, then it should be driven. You should be an ethics driven person. There's plenty of jobs available for people who want to lie. And Wall Street is the perfect example. And I highly recommend you get a job there because you do really well. But fundamentally, I don't think, it's really hard when you get around something like the UFO field, because what happens is the vast majority of people know something about it, but they don't know the depth levels. And the last thing that you want is the first thing for them to come to be some kind of CIA intel psyop program for their own consolidation or testing or whatever. That needs to be actively resisted and called out by an aware independent research field and by dark journalism. That's what it's about. That's what we're here for. We can get to a much better place with it. In fact, the UFO file and the research around it is so exciting, and it sort of blows away all of these really kind of small-minded attempts to spin it into a money defense program or a power grab or an emergency power blue beam. The actual realization of the whole thing and why those original researchers were drawn to it, why we're drawn to it, are the incredible stories that come through the human family, really, about this and have nothing to do with any psyops or program like that. I can tell you my grandmother told me about hanging clothes in Boston and seeing a cigar-shaped object at about 5 o'clock in the morning go very slowly and silently through the neighborhood. So these are the types of stories that we have. We understand it. We connect with it, and that's our realization. It has nothing to do with the spitball and the spin of the CIA and the media. That's for damn sure. So it's an important field, and we'll get it's a mystery, like I said, but we'll get as close to the truth on it as we can. Miss Olivia, the last question of the night.
Okay, Karen Carpenter, does DJ have a comment about Civil War being pushed?
Yeah, I think it is. I think they've turned up the heat and lowered the heat at different times, and it's hard to tell who's in charge. But whenever we get around elections, they seem to want to amp it up. And I think when they grabbed Trump, they were trying to excite Trump's supporters into that type of thing, because right afterwards they were like, oh, the domestic terror bill needs to be top priority, and they go through this whole thing about, oh, I don't believe in threats or intimidation from their side or our side. I think when it comes to pressing an issue, it's always, it's Gandhi, it's MLK. These are the people who knew how to press the issue. And there were always provocateurs sent in there to make them look violent and stuff. But you can't achieve things that way. And I would never recommend it. The way I would recommend it is through exposure, because it does something subconsciously. It's the 100th monkey effect. There's something that goes on in our subconscious when things are exposed. And that is the effect I think that we want the most. So we have that ability to do it. And they always want that reaction. And so, they also go into this whole victim trip, like, don't threaten law enforcement and all this stuff. I mean, you're raiding a private citizen's house who's your political opponent, and then they're like, if you say one bad thing about the FBI, you're a terrible U.S. citizen. No, look, if the FBI if they try to set up a citizen, that they're acting in a fascist Stasi style manner, there's no question about it. And, we've seen them do it before, and it seems to be this guy, Trump, is the one they like to do it to. Russian collusion, Peter Strzok, all this junk, right? So when you get up to that level of power, they're willing to do anything, including break all the rules, break all the laws. So, that organization has their own mending of their own actions. Look at the CIA. I mean, they need reform. If you call out the CIA, are you a bad citizen? Well, it's not a constitutional entity to start with. So it doesn't belong in the government. That's period. We've had 75 years of them interfering. And, so there needs to be like a kind of a wholesale rejection of the way that they do things. This assassinating Assange, the fact that that's coming to the public attention, this is how they roll. There's no respect for legalities or anything. And I do think the fact that Assange is rotting in a prison somewhere and soon to be extradited to the U.S. is also a really big problem, because in essence, what is the crime? He's a publisher showing evidence of a crime. So we have really big problems, and those problems relate directly to freedom of information. And that's exactly the thing that they're trying to stop. Freedom of speech. That's what they're trying to stop. And this is the thing that we have here in the Ideas Room together right now. It's what we've had tonight. And that's the thing I think they're most afraid of. So with that, Miss Olivia, I think we're going to wrap up tonight.
Okay.
What do you got?
I have so many generous super chatters to thank.
Thank you.
Starting with a cult fan, Mark Lane, Bobo the Clown, Stefania Leone, Ultra, Jim Sarge 3ID, Calvin Center, Robert Mathurin, Blazon River, Sandra Lavender, Arg Los, Larage, Global Atlantis, Eurythmias Fund, Bob Bindert, Debbie McAdoo, Big Papa Pump, Jim N, Stephen, Robert Scott, KV, this is going to be hard, Chirondium Drum, Wait a Minute 72, James Cregan, Jonathan Kiner, Jill and Joy R, John Lavalette, Jay Vandervest, Eork 01, Bo Krills, Simone Nyman, Diane Mulligan, Shazam, John F., Thomas Marzek, Medley Childress, Erica Swenson Elliott, Harvardian, PRBR, Violet Lotus, Planet Gone Nuts, Jam and Mammy, Karen Carpenter, and Gummy Bears, Deborah Strayer, Tanya in the Flux, Brian Berner, Channeling the Heart, Barbara Joyce, and Red Cinder 75. Thank you so much.
Oh, wow. Fantastic. Your support, we really appreciate it so much. It helps us keep going in the things that we're doing. We couldn't do it without you. And so we really thank you from the bottom of our heart for all that, and to all our subscribers and supporters. Thank you so much. It's invaluable to us. We'll be back with you next week. And we have a very interesting set of shows, some interviews coming up later this month as well. And we hope to get Dr. Farrell back on. It was great to have him in here tonight. Of course, Gigi Young. And so many exciting shows coming up for you. I'll do a couple of shout outs.
Actually, why don't you mention the subscriber only
I
episode
did.
again?
I did, actually, yeah. And that is, it's a fascinating episode we just did with Dr. Farrell. And that is called The Secret Money. That's great. Thank you, sir. So we got to have you back really soon. We're going to catch up shortly. I can't wait. There's Gigi out there. It's great to see you, Gigi. Nick Malone. Thank you, sir. Who else we got out there? Oh, right. I'm going to. Oh, let's see. Good night. Good night. Yes. Joseph says we need to talk privately. Re-Insla, Promise, and Reconasciuto. Whew. Yeah. Yeah. I can't wait for that one. I am counting the moments right now. I'm actually going to get in touch with you really shortly so we can do that. Najat, great to see you. Great show. Thank you so much. Fantastic. Bo Krills, fantastic to see you out there, sir. Rose Thistle, Karen Carpenter, Heidi Ann, thank you. We really appreciate it. We appreciate you being here. It's great to have the Ideas Room. Unbelievable questions. Miss Olivia, you did really an outstanding job. Bravo. And a great applause.
Do you want to throw everybody a bone?
About what?
Everybody always wants to know about that card behind you.
No, it's going to remain a mystery.
It's going to be a mystery.
But you can for sure see that it's got a
what
little,
does it say on
it's
it?
got a little wonder to it. It's definitely the Wizard of Oz, and of course it says there's no place like home.
There you go.
But that's a special one. There's no question about it. Rehoboth Farm. Life is about to get rough. Sure hope not, but you know. Encore, says Maury. I like that. Encore. Give me a little accent there, a little French accent.
Encore. You don't need a French accent. It sounds French already.
Catherine Harris, there's no place like home. Exactly. Bingo, 100%. Elijah Muhammad. Fantastic. Great show. Questions. Why do you think Trump didn't pardon Assange? Because he was into a proceeding, an impeachment proceeding, and I think that he didn't think that the Republicans would back him up because some of those Republicans were in league with the Democrats trying to silence Assange because he had called out a lot of crimes. So it was a big failure not to pardon Assange. I think it would have been an extraordinary move. And look, you know, what did Assange do in essence? What was it? What's the crime? You know, releasing state secrets. I mean, you know, fundamentally he exposed crimes, right? So that's the measure of a society. What do you do with your truth tellers? And ultimately, you know, we get into these situations.
Actually, truth be told, I don't think we've supported him enough. Not just us, but all of us.
Stargroves, Ireland. Good night, TJ. Yes, thank you. Good night. Look, I agree. I think there should be more attention placed on it. And I think with everything that goes on, it's easy to miss how important that case is. But we'll have an opportunity because they're going to try to extradite him. And I think that should be resisted all across the board. Modwiz, the man, the myth, he's out there. I think I can show that one. Ta-da. Thank you, sir. It's great to see you out there. Who else we got? Catherine Harris, doing great. Golden Girl. Whew. Dorothy is out there. I know Kate's out there. It's great to see you. Wow. What a fantastic group we had out there tonight. We will be back with you next week, maybe sooner. And have a great weekend. You know, as I say, you know, we're in interesting times here, but I think that awareness around the emergency powers is going to help us because we can see it coming from a mile away, and it makes all the difference. Brenda Fisher, it's great to see you. We will see you all next week, and have a fantastic weekend. And you know, Miss Olivia, it says end broadcast, but after all,
never really ends.
It never really ends. Have a great night, everyone.
Okay. God bless.
Bye-bye. We love you. And away.